Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories, where curiosity settles in gently and ancient mysteries unfold at a pace that never pressures the mind. Tonight's quiet journey drifts toward a place where the past refuses to behave like simple history. It carries a tone of something older, something that lingers in stone and sand as if waiting for someone patient enough to notice. The story ahead sinks its roots into the very beginning of Egypt's kingship, a beginning wrapped not only in myth, but in the suggestion that the world's earliest rulers might not have risen from the Nile soil at all. Instead, some say they were chosen, shaped, or guided by beings whose presence remained just outside the frame of human memory. The thought itself rests lightly, not demanding belief, simply offering a doorway into the earliest hours of civilization. Before we step toward that doorway, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight and what the time is in your corner of the sky. It's always grounding to pause for a moment and recognize that while this voice moves steadily forward, each person hearing it is drifting through their own moment, their own quiet space, their own version of the evening or the early morning. Some may be settling in after a long day, others beginning one. Some may be tucked beneath warm blankets, while others are sitting at a desk letting the hum of their surroundings fade. Wherever you are, thank you for spending a bit of your time here. If you find this exploration soothing or steadying, or simply a pleasant companion as you drift toward rest, I'd be grateful if you gave the video a like or perhaps subscribed. It helps this small corner of calm find others who might appreciate a slow, reflective space at the end of their day. But you don't need to do anything at all right now. You can just breathe, let your shoulders loosen, and let the story come to meet you. Because the story waiting for us is an old one. Older than dynasties, older than the famous faces carved in stone, older than the kings whose names still echo across tourist paths and museum halls. It steps back to a time before hieroglyphs had developed enough to capture complete thoughts, before the pyramids rose against the desert horizon, before the world imagined pharaohs as god-kings. This is a moment when the Nile still felt like a living creature discovering its own shape, when the people along its banks were forming the first threads of a unified land, and when something unusual seemed to happen, something that later generations remembered not as politics, or tribal alliances, or the slow building of a state, but as the arrival of beings who changed everything. Those beings, according to the whispers preserved in temple walls and ancient tales, were the Anunnaki. Not as distant figures in some unrelated mythology, but as teachers, guides, and overseers who selected certain humans to rule with a purpose that stretched beyond ordinary ambition. Whether these figures existed in a literal sense, or whether they represented an older memory carried forward in symbolic language, is a question that doesn't need to be solved tonight. Instead, we can simply follow the suggestion that Egypt's first rulers might have carried titles and responsibilities passed to them by something other than purely human councils. The earliest Egyptian king lists are fragments strung together across extremely long spans of time. They read like attempts to preserve memories too vast and too strange to fit comfortably within the boundaries of straightforward history. They begin not with names that scholars agree upon, but with figures called the followers of Horus, or before them the Shemsu Hor. These weren't kings in the earthly sense. They were described as beings who ruled before the first recognizable pharaohs appeared. The lists place them at the threshold between myth and recorded time, giving them reigns that stretch impossibly long, as though they existed in an age when the rules were different, when the world was young enough that extraordinary lives didn't feel out of place. Some researchers see these lists simply as mythology, but others notice something peculiar. The earliest dynasties that follow these supposed beings seem unusually advanced. The craftsmanship appears fully formed. The organizational systems feel more like continuations than beginnings. The first kings step into history already carrying symbols, knowledge, and architectural ambitions that seem much too polished for a civilization just emerging from prehistory. It's as if they inherited a structure instead of building one from scratch. This is where the idea enters quietly, not as a loud claim but as a calm possibility. What if the first pharaohs didn't rise in the usual way, through tribal dominance or early forms of political consolidation? What if they were selected by beings who wanted Egypt shaped in a specific direction? Beings whose influence was remembered dimly as that of gods not born of earth, but of the sky. Some ancient texts speak of these gods arriving from a distant place, carrying knowledge and authority that humans accepted without question, because the presence they brought felt larger than life, not supernatural, but simply beyond familiar understanding. In the Egyptian worldview, the pharaoh wasn't just a ruler, he was a mediator, a bridge, someone whose role wasn't only administrative but cosmic. This idea appears fully formed in the earliest dynasties, as though the position wasn't invented but inherited from something older. The pharaoh's job was to maintain balance, to uphold the order of the world, to keep chaos at bay. It's a heavy responsibility for someone newly elevated by mortal hands. But if the role were designed by beings who believed the ruler needed to reflect more than human authority, the concept begins to make sense. This night's journey doesn't aim to prove anything. Instead, it lets the earliest signs of kingship in Egypt settle into a context where the extraordinary feels surprisingly natural. The Anunnaki were often portrayed in Mesopotamian traditions as beings with long lifespans, advanced knowledge, and a hierarchy that resembled a structured council. Some stories describe them guiding early humans, teaching them agriculture, astronomy, architecture, and writing. If such beings existed, or if the stories that remember them preserve a distant truth, the possibility arises that they didn't limit their influence to one region. Civilizations didn't develop in isolation after all. People travelled, traded, and exchanged ideas across vast distances far earlier than many imagine today. But myths travelled even faster, or perhaps the beings behind those myths moved where they wished, leaving communities altered long after they departed. Egypt's early development doesn't look accidental. The unification under the first pharaohs happens with remarkable coordination. Pottery styles shift, art becomes standardized, cities appear with layout choices that suggest deliberate planning. Religious concepts form in cohesive patterns instead of scattered fragments. A system appears to fall into place rather than rise slowly across many generations. For some, these shifts are simply signs of cultural evolution. For others, they look like the results of direction, guidance, maybe even selection. The idea that the early rulers were chosen by the Anunnaki doesn't depend on imagining anything dramatic or disruptive. It could be something as subtle as individuals being taught by beings who possessed knowledge beyond their time. The selected ones might have been chosen for traits like leadership, intuition, resilience, or a capacity to understand teachings that required a leap beyond ordinary experience. Once taught, they wouldn't need constant supervision. They would simply carry forward the system set in motion, passing them to those who followed. In the quiet landscape of the ancient Nile Valley, such guidance would leave traces that blend into legend. The people who lived there wouldn't distinguish between advanced beings and gods. They would simply accept whoever brought wisdom as someone worthy of reverence. Over time, the memory of guidance would solidify into the belief that the pharaoh wasn't just a ruler, but a descendant or representative of the gods. Whether this meant literal descent or a symbolic link, the result was the same. The kings were perceived as chosen. This perception shaped the world that followed. It influenced architecture, rituals, and how the Egyptians understood life and death. It moulded their ideas of cosmic balance, celestial order, and the importance of continuing traditions exactly as they were received. The presence of something older behind their earliest kingship would make this devotion logical. If the first rulers learned their roles directly from beings who possessed immense knowledge, every pharaoh after them would have a reason to preserve that legacy with unwavering care. As we move gently deeper into this story, the idea expands without strain. It doesn't force the mind to accept literal interpretations. It simply invites the possibility that the earliest Egyptian kingship wasn't a sudden human invention. It might have been part of a larger tapestry that reached beyond humanity's beginning, shaped by beings remembered only as gods in the distant haze of time. The Anunnaki, whether symbolic or real, embodied a presence that early humans interpreted as divine, not because they needed myth, but because their experiences left them with no simpler language to describe what they had seen. Nothing here concludes anything. It only opens space for what comes next. The earliest kings of Egypt stand at the threshold now, waiting for us to follow their footsteps back into a world where the first pharaohs began not as rulers of a nation, but as chosen figures carrying responsibilities placed upon them by hands that may not have been entirely human. The world that existed before Egypt crowned its first kings wasn't empty or silent, but it carried a different kind of pace. The Nile drifted through a land that was still learning how to think of itself as a single place. People moved along its banks, carrying baskets, building small shelters, tracking the seasons, and shaping a life that revolved around the river's steady rhythm. The land wasn't yet divided into north and south under recognisable names, and the idea of a unified kingdom didn't exist. There were no crowns, no thrones, no monuments to rulers. There was only the slow march of communities rising and falling along the water's edge, each adapting to the river's moods. And somewhere within that quiet, the world was preparing for something that would change its course. The Nile of that time behaved differently than the world sees today. The annual floods rose higher, the silt drifted deeper, and the connection between the people and the land felt more direct. The settlements scattered along the river were modest, homes made of reeds, clay, and simple arrangements of stone formed clusters that grew and vanished with the seasons. The people didn't yet think in the long arcs of dynasties. Their concerns were immediate: food, warmth, protection, and making sense of a world that often felt unpredictable. But beneath the surface of these simple rhythms, something else stirred. A pattern forming before anyone recognized it. The people who lived along the early Nile weren't unaware of the world beyond their own boundaries. Ideas travelled along with traders, migrating families, and wandering storytellers. Though long distances separated early settlements, they shared tales of the sky and the earth, the forces that guided life and shaped the unseen. These stories didn't need to agree with one another. They simply reflected what people observed and felt. They noticed the stars shifting in regular paths. They noticed the floodwaters arriving with almost deliberate timing. They noticed that life seemed to revolve around patterns that arrived without their intervention. And so they formed stories that made sense of the world in a way that felt reasonable at the time. The connection to something larger never felt strange. It simply felt like part of life. This period before the rise of kingship is often imagined as a time of slow progress, but it contained more complexity than many assume. Early communities built rituals around the river, around the sky, and around the cycles that shaped their survival. These rituals weren't elaborate. They didn't involve grand temples or statues carved from stone. They were simple acts of respect toward forces they believed influenced their days. Even without written language, these practices formed the beginnings of collective identity. They provided structure when the world around them felt too large to control. These early expressions of belief became threads that later wove themselves into the grand tapestry of Egyptian religion. But in these early days, they were quiet, private, and deeply connected to the immediate environment. As people organized themselves into larger groups, leadership emerged naturally. There were individuals who understood seasonal patterns better than others. There were those who excelled in trade, diplomacy, or craftsmanship. These individuals often guided their communities, not as rulers, but as caretakers of knowledge. They didn't command armies. They didn't sit on thrones. They simply helped their people survive. This early form of leadership was fragile. It depended on the environment and on the trust people placed in those who seemed to have insight. But while these forms of authority existed, they were not yet kings. They lacked the idea of divine connection, and they lacked a structured hierarchy. The world still waited for something else. During this long period of preparation, nature provided both opportunities and challenges. The Nile's floods brought sustenance, but also destruction. Communities built along its banks had to adjust constantly, moving when the water encroached too far, rebuilding when the river withdrew. This relationship with the land required resilience and adaptability. Over time, these difficulties encouraged people to develop better techniques for farming, irrigation, and construction. Slowly, the scattered settlements began to resemble something more stable. They built granaries, workshops, and networks of trade that connected villages across miles of river coast. These connections didn't yet form a unified state, but they created a sense of shared experience. Despite this growing complexity, one element remained notably absent. There was still no concept of a ruler blessed by the gods. Authority did not flow from a central figure. Power was distributed among families, elders, or skilled individuals. Yet this absence did not mean the idea couldn't form. The foundations existed. The people already believed in forces that shaped the world. They observed the stars with attentive eyes. They mapped the cycles of nature without realizing they were building the framework for a calendar. They respected those who seemed to possess unusual knowledge. All of these elements formed a quiet structure, waiting for someone or something to tie it together into a cohesive system. What happened next in history appears sudden, though its roots were slowly growing. The first signs of unification appear when early communities began interacting more intensely. Trade routes expanded, shared agricultural practices spread. Symbols carved into pottery and small objects began to resemble more standardized forms. These symbols didn't yet form a full writing system, but they carried meaning recognizable across regions. Ideas were spreading from one settlement to another, and along with those ideas came stories that travelled farther than any individual could walk in a lifetime. Among these stories were tales of beings who didn't belong entirely to the world the people knew. They were often described as descending from the sky, or emerging from distant lands where knowledge and power existed on a scale beyond human comprehension. In some regions, these beings were remembered as ancestors. In others, they were messengers. In some traditions, they appeared as architects of the world itself. These stories didn't feel extraordinary to the people who carried them. They simply reflected encounters or memories passed through many generations. Whether symbolic or literal, the presence of these beings shaped how communities interpreted unusual events. In the early Nile Valley, such stories blended with local traditions. The people believed that the land was constantly watched over by unseen forces. They felt that the river's reliability reflected intention. The sky's patterns suggested order, and the earth's fertility seemed like a gift. The thought that beings of great power might influence the world's functioning didn't feel distant. It fit naturally into how they saw reality. Later generations would name such beings gods, but in this early period they were not defined so rigidly. They were simply part of the world's structure. It is within this context that the idea of individuals chosen by these beings begins to take shape. The earliest hints of rulership in Egypt didn't emerge as declarations of power. They appeared as symbols worn by certain individuals, small emblems, carvings, or adornments that suggested connection to something beyond human authority. These symbols weren't yet crowns or headdresses, but they represented the beginnings of status. Those who carried them weren't rulers yet, but they stood apart. Archaeological records sometimes reveal graves from this period that contain unusual items. Objects crafted with a level of skill not seen in surrounding settlements, materials that seem to come from distant regions, designs that don't match the local artistic language. These items raise questions about how certain individuals gained access to such materials or knowledge. They suggest connections that ordinary communities didn't possess. Perhaps trade explains some of it, but trade alone doesn't fully account for the sudden appearance of advanced techniques or foreign objects in the graves of people who lived in otherwise modest environments. Some researchers propose that these individuals belong to families involved in early forms of long-distance communication or travel. Others suggest they were simply innovators, but another possibility rests quietly alongside these explanations. Perhaps these individuals were taught directly by those beings remembered later as gods. If the Anunnaki existed as teachers or overseers, their influence may have appeared first not in the form of kingship, but in the elevation of individuals who understood their instruction. These early chosen figures may have been selected for their intelligence, adaptability, or willingness to learn. Once they carried this knowledge, they could share it with their communities, inadvertently preparing the Nile Valley for the Age of Kings. The gradual development of early administrative practices hints at something similar. As settlements grew larger, managing resources became more complicated. People needed to decide how to distribute grain, how to store food, how to maintain irrigation systems, and how to resolve disputes. These responsibilities couldn't be left to chance, and so individuals emerged who could oversee them. These early administrators may have been influenced by guidance from beings whose understanding of organization surpassed that of the communities they helped shape. Their role wasn't yet regal, but it was foundational. They helped standardize practices that would later form the backbone of a unified state. Meanwhile, the land itself was undergoing transformations. Climate shifts affected the river's patterns. Population density increased. Communities faced new challenges that required coordinated responses. In this context, the idea of a central authority started to feel not only possible but necessary. People began to look for individuals who possessed the qualities needed to guide larger groups. They wanted someone who could interpret signs from the natural world, anticipate changes, mediate disputes, and maintain harmony. These roles carried a sense of spiritual responsibility. The people believed that the person who took on such responsibilities must have insight derived from more than ordinary experience. This belief created fertile ground for the emergence of rulership, but it didn't yet create kings. A king needed more than administrative skill. A king needed legitimacy that reached beyond human approval. And that legitimacy arrived from beliefs about beings who shaped the world. If people believed that a ruler was selected or instructed by such beings, their authority became something larger than mere leadership. It became something sacred. The earliest signs of this shift appear in symbolic artifacts: a carved palette bearing images of powerful beings, a ceremonial object depicting a figure receiving authority from a creature with wings or unusual features. These depictions are often interpreted through artistic or ritualistic explanations, but they may reflect memories of encounters or teachings that took place long before people learned how to record them accurately. When these symbols appear, they mark the transition from leadership grounded in human skill to leadership grounded in something perceived as divine. During this period, the Nile Valley didn't yet know the form its kingship would take. The people didn't know that their descendants would build monuments that would stand for thousands of years. They didn't know that their beliefs would become foundational to one of the world's most enduring civilizations. They simply followed the patterns that made survival possible, and within those patterns, something built quietly, a structure forming like sediment beneath the river's surface. Unseen at first, but essential to everything that would come later. Eventually the conditions aligned. The people needed unity, they needed guidance, and they needed a figure who could embody both earthly authority and divine sanction. Whether the individuals who stepped into this role were influenced by beings beyond their world, or whether they interpreted their own insights as divine, is something we can't definitively know. But the stories that survived suggest that the first kings didn't rise by accident. They emerged from a landscape already shaped by knowledge that didn't seem entirely local. They carried symbols that appeared suddenly and fully formed. They acted with confidence that suggested instruction. And they laid the foundation for a civilization that would become renowned for its stability, complexity, and longevity. The Nile waited for its first kings, not in stillness, but in preparation. The land, the people, and the beliefs all moved gradually toward a moment when rulership would emerge, not as a simple consolidation of power, but as a role imbued with significance drawn from a source older than history. When the first individuals stepped into this role, they weren't stepping into something they created. They were stepping into something prepared for them long before they arrived. The shift from the quiet world of early settlements to the moment remembered as the night the gods stepped down did not arrive with chaos or spectacle. It came as something steady, something that communities along the Nile would later retell with a mixture of awe and inevitability. Long before written language could capture the details, long before scribes carved symbols into stone, memories of these events travelled through stories carried by families who lived close to the river. These stories became so deeply rooted that later generations accepted them not as myths, but as fragments of something real. The calm of those early nights held more than the sound of insects or the distant cry of a night bird. They held the sense that something beyond ordinary life had made contact with the world. The people living in the pre-dynastic Nile Valley had already grown accustomed to unusual sights. The desert horizon often played tricks. The sky shifted colours in ways that created illusions. The river reflected shapes that made the imagination wander. But those illusions came and went, leaving nothing behind. The event remembered as the descent of the gods was different. It left traces, it left impressions, and it left a feeling that lingered for generations, shaping the earliest understanding of who had the right to lead. The night itself was remembered in fragments. Villagers spoke of an unusual stillness that settled across the land. The wind, normally moving gently through reeds and along the riverbank, seemed to stop. The animals behaved differently. Livestock stood quietly instead of shifting restlessly. Dogs stayed near their shelters instead of wandering. Birds remained perched even as darkness settled, with none taking flight. These observations may seem trivial, but for people who lived close to nature, even small changes carried meaning. To them, the world behaved as though it were holding its breath. The sky above the river carried a clarity that night that observers found unsettling. Stars appeared brighter than usual, as though the air itself had been scrubbed clean. Some described the constellations looking sharper, as if they were closer. Others claimed that the patterns of light seemed to move in ways subtly different from normal star movements. These accounts were not written at the time. They were passed through generations verbally, slowly shifting but maintaining a common theme. Something in the sky caught people's attention long before anything unusual happened on the ground. At some point during this unusually still night, something appeared near the horizon. It wasn't described as a star or a fire. It wasn't described as an object with familiar shape. Instead, those who preserved the memory said it was a brightening, a glow that seemed to rise and fall as though it were breathing. This light grew gradually, moving with a steadiness that made people unsure whether it came from the sky or the earth. Whatever its origin, the light moved closer at a pace that didn't stir fear at first. It stirred confusion. The people watching it didn't flee. They simply observed, unsure of what they were witnessing. The glow's movement across the land didn't resemble anything natural. It didn't flicker like fire. It didn't leap or waver. It moved with a purpose. As it drew nearer, villagers reported that the air grew heavier, not in temperature but in sensation, as if an invisible presence pushed against everything in its path. Livestock stumbled when trying to move. Water in clay bowls rippled. The earth underfoot didn't shake, but people felt a faint pressure, like the pulse of something immense passing through the ground. These details were carried into later accounts that scribes eventually preserved in symbolic form. They depicted gods arriving from the horizon, not rising from the river or emerging from the mountains, but descending from above. When the glow reached the riverbank near one of the early settlements, eyewitnesses claimed that the light shifted into a more defined form. Some described tall shapes emerging from its centre. Others said the light became a pathway from which figures stepped forward. These figures were not remembered as phantoms or vague shapes. They were described as beings with form, presence, and deliberate movements. Their outlines differed slightly depending on who told the story, but most descriptions agreed that they were taller than humans, with proportions that seemed deliberate and controlled. They moved in ways that suggested purpose rather than exploration. These beings did not speak in a language the people understood. They communicated through gestures, through movements, through the way they observed the environment. Some accounts suggested the beings carried objects that emitted faint glows. Others claimed that the beings wore coverings or garments unlike anything the people had seen. But even with these differences in detail, the central idea remained consistent. The beings were not interpreted as threats. They were interpreted as visitors whose presence marked a shift in the world's order. The people of the Nile Valley approached these beings cautiously at first. They didn't run or hide. They simply moved slowly, drawn by curiosity. Something about the visitors instilled a sense of calm rather than fear. Later generations would describe this calm as reverence, but at the time, it may have been something deeper. The beings didn't make sudden movements. They didn't display aggression. They simply observed the people who gathered before them, and after a moment of quiet assessment, the beings extended gestures that the early villagers interpreted as invitations. Over time, the story gained additional layers. Some versions describe the beings pointing toward the sky, as though indicating where they came from. Others describe the beings pointing toward specific individuals among the villagers. The selection of these individuals wasn't explained. The villagers chosen were not necessarily the strongest or the wealthiest. In fact, many accounts mention that the chosen ones were people recognized for their ability to understand or observe. These individuals may have been those responsible for early rituals, or those who monitored seasonal changes, or those who tended to the community's needs. Their selection created a deep impression. The visitors did not stay long. They observed, selected, and then moved toward a nearby elevated patch of land, leaving impressions in the soil that villagers later treated as sacred. These impressions were not ordinary footprints. They were deeper than human footprints, as if something heavier had pressed into the earth. Some impressions seemed broader or shaped differently, leading people to conclude that the visitors did not move like humans. The soil preserved these marks for several seasons before winds eventually filled them in. But the impact on the culture remained. The individuals chosen by the visitors didn't speak of receiving explicit instructions. Instead, they described feeling compelled to direct their communities differently. They organized people to move resources, to build structures with specific arrangements, to mark certain spots along the riverbank. These decisions didn't follow previous patterns. They introduced new ways of thinking, new practices, and new forms of organization that slowly transformed the settlements. Some later scholars called this coincidence. Others believed it reflected the beginning of divine kingship. The night of the descent didn't end with dramatic events. After their selection and brief interactions with the villagers, the beings returned to the glow that had carried them. The light receded across the riverbank and rose into the sky with the same steadiness it had displayed when it arrived. It didn't fly upward quickly, it simply lifted until it faded into the stars. The villagers watched it go until it disappeared completely. Once the glow vanished, the stillness of the night returned, but the world no longer felt the same. Life would continue, but a mark had been left on the land. In the days that followed, the selected individuals began gathering their communities. They spoke of the visitors not as enemies or strangers, but as bearers of knowledge. They believed their presence signalled a shift in the order of the world. The communities responded with willingness. They trusted those chosen, and they followed their guidance. Small settlements began cooperating more closely. Rituals changed. The people began building symbols into the earth to mark where the visitors had stepped. These early symbols formed the foundations of what would later be known as sacred architecture. Across the generations that followed, these stories transformed. The beings were no longer remembered simply as visitors. They became gods. The selected individuals became remembered as the first intermediaries, and the impressions left in the soil became remembered as the proof of divine presence. The night became legendary. It became the cornerstone of early Egyptian beliefs surrounding rulership. People came to accept that the right to lead didn't come from human approval alone. It came from a connection to beings who existed beyond the ordinary world. When early scribes eventually carved stories into stone, they preserved the tale in symbolic language. They depicted gods descending from the sky, offering authority to chosen humans. They portrayed these events not as legends, but as the beginning of everything that followed. The first depictions of divine coronation ceremonies echoed the memory of that night. The iconography showed gods placing their hands upon the heads of rulers. It showed the symbol of kingship descending from the heavens. These images weren't inventions. They were interpretations of memories that had been carried through centuries of storytelling. As time progressed, the memory of the event became interwoven with the religious system of the early dynasties. The pharaoh became the living embodiment of the connection first established on that night. The belief that rulers were chosen by the gods wasn't metaphorical. It stemmed from a memory that the earliest leaders had indeed been selected by beings who stepped down from a glow that came from beyond the familiar world. Every coronation, every ritual, every symbol of kingship carried a shadow of that night. Although the details blurred over time, the villagers who originally witnessed the event left behind impressions in their descendants. These descendants carried a respect for order, for leadership, and for the idea that the world's structure was shaped by beings beyond human comprehension. The weight of that memory reinforced the pharaoh's role for millennia. It shaped how rulers governed, how priests interpreted celestial signs, and how ordinary people understood their place in the world. The memory of the night the gods stepped down did not fade. It became part of the foundation of Egyptian identity. Even as the civilization grew more complex, even as writing developed, even as dynasties rose and fell, the story endured. It guided the actions of early rulers who believed they were fulfilling a responsibility inherited from those first chosen individuals. It shaped the rituals that accompanied rulership, and it influenced the monumental architecture that would come to define Egypt's legacy. The footprints left by the visitors may have vanished from the soil, but the impressions they left on human memory remained. These impressions guided the earliest kings, encouraged unity among the people, and shaped the direction of the civilization. Whenever early Egyptians spoke of gods walking among men, they weren't speaking figuratively. They were preserving a memory of a night when something descended from the horizon, changed the course of human history, and set the stage for the first pharaohs who would carry that influence forward into the world that was taking shape along the Nile. The earliest memory of the beings who descended along the Nile did not fade quickly. It settled into the collective mind with a clarity that felt almost inherited. Even generations later, people who had never seen the event spoke of it, as though the images were carved into their understanding of the world. From that memory grew a belief that the visitors carried intentions shaped long before humans knew how to measure time. The night their footprints pressed into the ground became more than a story. It became the reference point for what authority meant, and it shaped the idea that leadership should not emerge through struggle or competition. Leadership, the people believed, came from selection. The individuals chosen during that night weren't remembered as rulers at first. They were remembered as those who had been recognized. The villagers believed that the visitors saw something in them that others could not see. This belief didn't create arrogance, it created responsibility. The people chosen carried the weight of a moment that had altered the direction of their communities. It changed how neighbours looked at them. It changed how disputes were resolved. It influenced how rituals were performed. And over time, this shift became the seed of something larger. Those who studied the early formation of Egypt often point to symbols, pottery, and settlement patterns as evidence of growing organisation. But beneath those visible traces, the transformation of the Nile Valley depended on something less tangible. It depended on the belief that authority required validation from beings who existed outside human experience. This belief didn't arise out of superstition. It arose from a memory carried forward by people who had witnessed something that reshaped their expectations for guidance. The chosen individuals began working with a sense of direction that seemed new to the people around them. They organized the construction of simple structures that served as gathering places. They developed more efficient ways to divide labor during harvest seasons. They introduced practices that encouraged cooperation between families. These actions didn't resemble ordinary leadership. They resembled a form of administration that carried intention. It wasn't about imposing control. It was about shaping communities into something more stable. Observers of this period often wonder how these early leaders gained the knowledge necessary to perform such tasks. The explanation offered by later generations was simple. They had received guidance. The nature of that guidance wasn't described in dramatic terms. It wasn't delivered through visions or proclamations. Instead, the chosen individuals described learning in ways that felt natural, as if insights arrived through steady observation and clarity. Some believed that the beings who descended had imparted knowledge indirectly, possibly through symbols or gestures that the chosen individuals interpreted instinctively. This interpretation gained strength with time as communities saw how consistently these individuals made decisions that improved their lives. As these early leaders continued their work, patterns formed that would later become fundamental aspects of Egyptian society. They developed systems for tracking the flood cycles more accurately. They organized storage of grain in ways that prevented shortages during lean seasons. They implemented methods for resolving conflicts that emphasized fairness. These advancements didn't appear suddenly. They emerged gradually, but they emerged with a consistency that suggested direction. Over time, the chosen individuals began to gather in specific areas to discuss matters affecting the entire region. These meetings were rare at first, but their importance grew as the needs of the communities expanded. People began to travel from distant settlements to consult them. Families brought disputes or concerns to these gatherings. The chosen individuals didn't impose their decisions. They offered interpretations of what they believed aligned with the guidance they had received. Their authority wasn't enforced, it was accepted. The communities along the Nile grew more connected as these gatherings increased. People discovered that their challenges were similar across different regions. They faced the same changes in the river's behavior. They experienced the same pressures from the environment. They struggled with similar questions about the cycles of life. This shared experience helped unify the people long before they considered themselves part of a single land, and the chosen individuals served as the link. Some accounts from later dynasties describe these early chosen ones as carrying markings or symbols that distinguished them from ordinary people. These markings weren't necessarily tattoos or carvings. They may have been forms of clothing, adornments, or small objects given by the visitors. The exact nature of these symbols is uncertain, but their purpose is clear. They identified individuals who had been selected by the beings remembered as gods. The presence of these symbols had a significant effect on the communities. People saw them as signs that the chosen individuals carried a connection that others did not. This connection created trust, and it also established the earliest framework for divine authority. The idea that someone carried a mark from the gods became a foundation for the belief that leadership required more than skill. It required recognition from a higher order. As the chosen individuals continued their work, they introduced practices that were unfamiliar to many. They emphasized the importance of aligning structures with certain positions of the sun and stars. They taught others to observe the sky with greater precision. They encouraged the construction of early ceremonial spaces that reflected celestial patterns. These actions didn't form a full religion. They built the first layers of what would later become the Egyptian understanding of the universe's order. The people didn't resist these changes. They embraced them, believing they came from the beings who had descended. The beings themselves were not remembered as interacting frequently with the people. Their appearance on that night was unique. The chosen individuals believed that the beings expected humans to learn, adapt, and guide themselves using the principles they had been given. This belief created a sense of autonomy. The chosen ones didn't rely on further visits. They relied on the knowledge they believed had been bestowed upon them. As time moved forward, the chosen individuals began raising others who could continue their work. They taught younger members of their communities how to read the land, how to interpret natural signs, and how to manage resources. This process didn't resemble the birth of royalty. It resembled the formation of a lineage of knowledge. Over generations, these teachings would become the foundation for the class of priests, administrators, and eventually rulers. When these early leaders passed away, their communities treated them with great respect. Their burial practices began to differ from those of ordinary people. They were placed in graves that reflected their status. Objects believed to hold power or significance were buried with them. These burial practices laid the groundwork for the elaborate tombs seen in later dynasties. The concept of preserving the memory of a leader through burial offerings didn't arise spontaneously. It emerged from a desire to honor those who had been chosen by the visitors. As centuries passed, the stories of the chosen individuals grew more detailed. They were remembered as intermediaries between the world of humans and the world of the gods. Their teachings became sacred texts. Though they were not written at the time, they were preserved verbally. The people who carried these stories made sure they were passed down carefully. They believed that these stories held the keys to understanding the purpose of their leaders and the destiny of their land. By the time early writing systems emerged, the memory of the chosen ones had become deeply rooted. The symbols used to record these stories blended sky imagery with human forms. They depicted the connection between the chosen leaders and the beings who descended. These symbols became part of the identity of the early dynasties. They appeared in royal iconography, religious texts, and ceremonial objects. The connection between the rulers and the visitors was presented as fact. Some early inscriptions described the rulers as descendants of the gods. This didn't imply purely biological descent. It implied inheritance of authority. The rulers believed they carried the same spiritual recognition that the chosen individuals had received on that night. They believed their right to rule came from the same source, and their people accepted this belief, because the memory of the visitors remained strong. The beings remembered as the Anunnaki were interpreted differently across regions. In some areas they were seen as creators. In others, they were teachers. In some traditions, they were described as guardians who monitored the development of early civilizations. These varying interpretations didn't create conflict. They reflected the way stories transform as they travel. But the central theme remained consistent. The beings played a role in guiding humanity. The presence of these beings in early Egyptian memory didn't conflict with the development of their religious system. Instead, it supported it. The Egyptians believed that the gods interacted with the world through symbols, signs, and chosen individuals. The night the gods stepped down became the origin of this belief. It gave legitimacy to the idea that the divine realm intervened in human affairs with purpose. It reinforced the concept that leadership must reflect cosmic order. As time continued, the chosen individuals' descendants or successors began consolidating regions under their guidance. They didn't force unification. They built connections by sharing resources, rituals, and knowledge. People followed because they believed the chosen ones understood the will of the gods. This belief provided the foundation for the early stages of state formation. The chosen leaders acted with confidence because they believed their actions served a larger purpose. The people who would later be known as the first pharaohs didn't emerge suddenly. They rose gradually, through generations of leadership shaped by an event that had become a guiding memory. The dynasty that formed wasn't created through conquest. It formed through the acceptance of authority that people believed descended from beings older and wiser than humanity itself. In these centuries before the official birth of the pharaonic state, the Nile Valley witnessed the slow transformation of belief into structure. Ceremonial sites grew more elaborate. Symbols became more standardized. Leadership roles became more formalized. The chosen individuals or their successors transitioned from community leaders to figures of reverence. This transition didn't require force. It relied on the belief that humans existed within a larger framework set by the visitors. The beings remembered as the Anunnaki were no longer present physically, but their influence remained embedded in the choices the early leaders made. Their selection of individuals planted the seeds for a lineage of rulers who carried the memory of that night into their governance. The chosen ones became the model for divine rulership. The beings became the foundation for the idea that kingship required connection to the heavens. As the memory matured, it became inseparable from the identity of Egypt. The story of the chosen ones shaped the expectations of rulers. It shaped the responsibilities they carried. It shaped the rituals performed during coronation ceremonies. And as new generations rose, they didn't question the origin of their leaders' authority. They accepted that their rulers had been chosen long before they themselves were born. The birth of Egypt's earliest dynasty carried the imprint of the beings who stepped down from the sky. The leaders who rose from that lineage believed their authority came from the visitors. Their people believed it too. And so the memory of that night shaped the rise of a civilization that would endure for thousands of years, guided by the belief that the hands of the gods had set their rulers on a path long before the first crowns ever existed. The transformation of the chosen individuals into the first divine rulers did not occur in a single season. It unfolded gradually as the memory of the night the visitors descended settled into the lives of the people who witnessed it. What began as a quiet shift in perception grew into a belief that shaped every corner of society. These leaders were no longer seen only as administrators or organizers. They were regarded as bearers of something that came from beyond the ordinary patterns of human life. Their presence carried the weight of a connection to forces that were believed to exist beyond the reach of the world the people already understood. In this atmosphere, the notion of divine rulers took form with a steadiness that felt natural to those who lived through it. The individuals selected by the visitors began demonstrating qualities that communities interpreted as signs of their distinct role. They showed an elevated understanding of the environment. They anticipated seasonal changes with accuracy that surpassed the expectations of their peers. They coordinated projects with an ease that suggested a deeper comprehension of how resources should be used. Their decisions consistently resulted in improvements to daily life. These leaders did not explain their abilities in extraordinary terms. They worked quietly and steadily, as though they were simply following principles they had been taught. Their communities didn't view this as strange. They saw it as evidence that the beings who descended had chosen them for a purpose. Over time, the chosen individuals developed practices that were considerably more structured than anything seen before. They emphasized the need for records, even before writing emerged in recognizable form. They encouraged the use of marks, symbols, and carved shapes to track events or store information. These early symbols were simple, but they formed the foundation for the system that would eventually become a complete written language. The process of documentation wasn't introduced abruptly. It was cultivated over years, subtly shaping the way people thought about memory, tradition, and responsibility. The chosen ones also introduced rituals that gave communities a sense of order. These rituals were not elaborate in their earliest form. They centered on observations of the sky, gatherings during certain points of the flood cycle, and respectful acknowledgements of natural forces. These practices taught people to see the world as a structured place, where cycles mattered and where balance needed to be preserved. This approach to life matched the teachings believed to have come from the visitors. The early rituals did not seek to impose control through fear. They guided people toward recognition of the world's interconnectedness. As the chosen individuals continued to shape their communities, a new idea slowly formed. It was the idea that the leaders carried not only knowledge but a form of essence that connected them to the visitors. This essence wasn't described in supernatural terms. It was interpreted through the qualities the leaders exhibited. They displayed endurance in difficult circumstances. They displayed judgment that seemed beyond their years. They showed an ability to resolve conflicts with fairness that earned the trust of their people. the perception that they possessed a special nature grew stronger with each generation. This evolving belief led to the idea that the chosen ones carried something within them that ordinary people did not. Some described it as the breath the visitors gave them. Others described it as a spark or force inherited from those who selected them. The language varied across different communities, but the meaning remained consistent. The chosen individuals were believed to possess a mixture of human qualities and traits gifted or awakened by the beings who descended. The earliest forms of this belief appear subtly in later inscriptions. The term blood of the gods was used not to describe biological descent in modern terms, but to express the idea that rulers carried the legacy of a connection established long ago. The rulers weren't seen as separate from humanity. They were seen as enhanced by something that linked them to the visitors. This belief shaped how people understood lineage. Leadership no longer rested solely on individual merit or community trust. It rested on inheritance of a role believed to be connected to the origins of guidance itself. As these beliefs deepened, communities began to interpret certain traits in children as signs that they might be suited to continue the legacy of leadership. A child who demonstrated analytical thinking, calm temperament, or early maturity was believed to possess qualities that aligned with the chosen individuals. These children were given responsibilities early. They were taught the practices developed by their predecessors. They learned how to track seasons, how to organize labor, and how to interpret natural signs. This education didn't resemble formal schooling. It resembled mentorship, where each generation prepared the next to carry on the lineage. This method of cultivating future leaders created continuity. People no longer saw leadership as something that appeared by chance. They saw it as something nurtured over time. The lineage of the chosen individuals became a living thread that extended from the night the visitors arrived into every generation that followed. Communities felt secure because they believed their leaders were part of a continuous line that reached back to the beings who descended. As the early dynastic structures began forming, the ritualistic aspects of leadership grew more pronounced. The process of selecting and preparing a new leader involved ceremonies that symbolized the transfer of responsibility. These ceremonies were not yet formal coronations, but they carried elements of them. Elders placed symbolic objects into the hands of the successor. They recited stories of the night the visitors descended. They invoked the idea that leadership required harmony with the principles given by the beings who first chose their ancestors. The symbolism reinforced the belief that leadership was not simply inherited through family, but through connection to a greater purpose. The people believed that the chosen individuals possessed a certain balance of qualities that aligned with the teachings of the visitors. They believed these leaders understood how to maintain harmony between the land, the river, and the sky. This belief became central to the development of divine rulership. It wasn't enough for a leader to be strong or intelligent. They needed to embody balance. They needed to represent the connection between the world they governed and the forces believed to shape its cycles. This concept shaped how early leaders presented themselves. They didn't portray themselves as warriors or rulers through force. They portrayed themselves as caretakers of the land. They emphasized their role in maintaining order and guiding their people towards stability. This approach differentiated them from leaders in other early civilizations. It created a unique identity for Egyptian rulership that blended authority with responsibility to uphold cosmic balance. As the centuries turned, the presence of the visitors continued to influence the development of leadership, even without further direct contact. The chosen individuals still believed they were working according to principles established by the beings who descended. These principles guided how they organized construction projects, how they developed agricultural systems, and how they managed resources. The development of irrigation canals, storage facilities, and early architectural structures all reflected an underlying belief in precision and alignment with natural patterns. These advancements came from human effort, but they were shaped by a belief that the world functioned according to a design introduced long ago. This mindset influenced the development of early structures that later became temples. These early structures weren't elaborate. They were simple spaces where communities gathered for rituals and discussions. The leaders used these spaces to guide people in matters of daily life and to reinforce their connection to the night the visitors descended. These structures eventually grew in complexity as communities expanded. They became symbols of stability and continuity. They served as reminders of the origins of leadership and of the principles believed to have been introduced by the visitors. The growing complexity of rituals influenced the perception of the chosen individuals. Over time, these leaders became more than administrators. They became central figures in ceremonies that reinforced the community's connection to the origin of divine authority. The people saw them as individuals who carried the breath of the visitors, the essence that allowed them to interpret the world with clarity. This belief created a foundation for the idea of kingship grounded in divine recognition. One of the key elements that shaped this development was the belief in the dual nature of the rulers. They were seen as both human and connected to something beyond humanity. This dual nature wasn't described in dramatic terms. It was explained through the behaviours and actions of the leaders. They demonstrated understanding that surpassed ordinary experience. They made decisions that reflected long-term thinking. They acted with consistency and confidence that people believed came from the teachings of the visitors. As these leaders grew in prominence, their communities began to view them as embodiments of the link between the human world and the world of the gods. This link became a central concept in the rise of early dynasties. The leaders weren't worshipped. They were respected as carriers of a role that came from the visitors. This respect strengthened their authority and allowed them to unify multiple settlements under a shared leadership structure. The belief in the divine nature of rulership shaped the development of law and governance. Leaders introduced systems that emphasize fairness, responsibility, and stability. These systems reflected the values believed to have been introduced by the visitors. Over time, these systems became formalized, laying the foundation for the legal and administrative structures that later characterized Egyptian civilization. The connection between leadership and divine guidance provided consistency across generations. As the tradition deepened, the leaders became associated with specific symbols that represented their connection to the visitors. These symbols appeared in early carvings, ceremonial objects, and decorative items. They often depicted connections between the sky and the earth, emphasizing the belief that rulers acted as intermediaries. These symbols later evolved into the iconic regalia associated with Egyptian royalty. But in these early centuries, they functioned as reminders of the night the visitors descended. By the time the first pharaohs rose, the belief in divine rulership had become firmly established. The people accepted that their rulers possessed a blend of human nature and divine essence. They believed the rulers carried the breath of the visitors and the blood of the ancestors chosen by them. This belief created a stable foundation for the rise of the dynasties. The people trusted their rulers because they believed they inherited a role shaped by forces older than human history. The making of the first divine rulers was not a process of dramatic transformation. It was a gradual unfolding of ideas, beliefs, and practices that grew from a single night long before written memory. The selected individuals became the foundation for a lineage that carried responsibility, knowledge, and purpose. They guided their communities with principles shaped by the teachings of the visitors, and as generations passed, these leaders became the embodiment of the connection between the world of humans and the world beyond. The divine rulers emerged not through conquest, but through continuity. Their authority grew from trust, memory, and belief. Their identity formed through the merging of human qualities, with the legacy of a moment when beings stepped down from the sky and set the course for a civilization that would endure for thousands of years. The idea of a throne in the earliest days of Egypt did not begin with stone, gold, or any of the materials that would later define royal power. It began with something far quieter, something that existed in the minds of the people long before tools became sophisticated enough to carve monuments. The throne in those early times was not a physical seat. It was a presence. It was a recognition of authority that came from a night when the sky opened in a way the people had never imagined. They believed that the individuals chosen by the visitors carried a kind of energy that could shape the future. This energy was not explained in words. It was felt in the way those individuals approached the world. Over time, this presence became associated with leadership, guidance, and the right to make decisions that influence many lives. As the chosen individuals continued their work, the notion of a symbolic throne grew alongside the belief that they carried the essence of the visitors. The throne was imagined not as something one could see or touch, but as something that surrounded the leader. It represented the authority given by the beings who had stepped down from the sky. This symbolic throne had no specific location. It followed the chosen individual wherever they went. The people believed that the leader carried an invisible mark that connected them to the night of descent. The leader's presence felt different because it reminded everyone that their authority came from a moment that reshaped the world. As generations passed and the memory matured, the symbolic throne began to take form in the physical world. The chosen leaders guided their communities toward increasingly complex forms of organization. They mobilized people to build structures for rituals, gatherings, and resource management. As these structures grew in size and sophistication, the people felt that the throne needed a physical expression as well. It needed a designated place where the leader could address the community. At first, these places were simple raised platforms made from packed earth or arranged stones. The leader didn't sit upon them. They stood and spoke, guided by the responsibilities entrusted to them. Over time, these raised areas became symbolic centres. Communities began gathering around them more frequently, not only during rituals but also to discuss matters of daily life. These gatherings reinforced the belief that the leader's position required fixed guidance, and that the symbolic throne needed a more defined structure. The leader didn't demand this. The people created it naturally. They wanted a place that reflected the significance of the role the chosen ones carried. They wanted something that honoured the connection between their leader and the beings who selected them. This desire shaped their early designs. As construction skills improved, these platforms evolved into more elaborate structures. They became built from better materials, shaped with greater precision, and decorated with symbols that reflected the community's beliefs. These structures didn't resemble the thrones that would later appear in Egyptian iconography. They were humble compared to later standards, but they represented the first physical expressions of leadership tied to divine selection. The people saw these platforms as places where the leader's connection to the visitors could be felt more clearly. The structures served as focal points where the presence of authority gathered. The concept of the throne continued to transform as the community's understanding of leadership deepened. The chosen individuals were believed to carry knowledge passed down from the visitors, and this belief shaped how the people interpreted the leader's actions. When the leader stood before them on one of the early platforms, the people felt that the leader was not simply giving orders. They believed the leader was translating principles that came from a source beyond the human world. This interpretation strengthened the symbolic throne, giving it meaning that reached far beyond its physical form. Eventually, the symbolic throne gained a ritualistic dimension. Ceremonies began to centre around it. These ceremonies weren't elaborate at first, but they reinforced the connection between the leader's authority and the visitor's influence. The throne became a place where leaders received blessings from elders, where stories of the night of descent were retold, and where community decisions were announced. The people believed that standing upon the throne-bound platform aligned the leader with the principles introduced by the visitors. This belief created continuity across generations. As the leader's authority grew, the symbolic throne took on new meaning. It began to represent not only the chosen individual, but also the lineage that had developed from the original selection. The throne symbolized the unbroken line that connected the present leaders to the ancestors who witnessed the descent of the visitors. This lineage became central to the identity of the leaders. They did not inherit the throne simply because they were born into a particular family. They inherited it because they carried qualities believed to connect them to the visitors' teachings. When the early dynastic period approached, the symbolic throne had grown into something that required a physical object to embody it fully. The communities believed that the leader needed a tangible seat that reflected the nature of their authority. This desire coincided with the increasing sophistication of craftsmanship. Artisans began carving objects with greater precision, using materials that symbolized strength and stability. The throne emerged from this convergence of belief and skill. It wasn't just a seat, it was a physical representation of the connection that shaped the lineage of leadership. The earliest physical thrones were simple compared to those seen in later periods, but they carried the weight of centuries of belief. They were crafted from wood, shaped carefully, and decorated with symbols that reflected the community's understanding of the visitors. Some featured carvings of celestial patterns. Others included shapes that represented the connection between the earth and sky. These symbols were not decorative. They expressed the belief that the throne bridged the human world and the world of the visitors. As the communities grew into early states, the throne gained importance. It became the center of ceremonies that formalized the leader's role. When new leaders ascended to this position, they did so in rituals that emphasized their connection to the lineage established by the visitors. They touched the throne, stood before it, or were seated upon it to symbolize their acceptance of responsibility. These actions reinforced the belief that the leader's authority came from a source beyond human understanding. The throne also influenced the design of early ceremonial spaces. As structures became more permanent, the throne needed a place that reflected its significance. Builders expanded the platforms into early forms of temples or meeting halls. These spaces were not yet the grand temples seen in later Egyptian culture, but they reflected a growing understanding of how architecture could symbolize spiritual and political authority. The throne sat at the center of these spaces, allowing the leader to interact with the community in a way that echoed the original moment of selection. The throne's position within these spaces reinforced its symbolic function. It stood at a point that aligned with sunrises, river patterns, or star positions, reflecting the belief that leadership required harmony with natural forces. These alignments were not accidental. They were deliberate choices made by leaders who believed that their actions needed to reflect the principles they inherited. The throne became a tool for maintaining this alignment. As the rituals surrounding leadership evolved, the throne gained additional symbolic layers. It no longer represented only the presence of the chosen individual. It represented the presence of the lineage, the connection to the visitors, and the unity of the communities. The throne became a symbol of continuity, reminding people that leadership was not an isolated event. It was part of a cycle that extended far beyond any individual leader's life. The evolution of the throne mirrored the evolution of the leaders themselves. As the chosen individuals transformed into formal rulers, the throne transformed into a central symbol of kingship. The people believed that the leader seated on the throne embodied a mixture of human experience and the essence of the visitors. This belief shaped the early concept of a ruler who was both human and connected to something beyond humanity. This dual nature became a defining feature of early Egyptian kingship. In time, the throne gained a presence in ritualistic art. Carvings depicted leaders seated upon it, receiving objects from celestial beings or engaging in ceremonies that emphasized their connection to the divine. These depictions didn't aim to exaggerate. They aimed to preserve the memory of the night the visitors descended. The throne became the visual embodiment of that memory. It reminded people where their leadership began. As the early dynasties formed, the throne acquired names, symbols, and rituals that reinforced its significance. It became associated with specific materials, colours, and shapes. These elements weren't chosen arbitrarily. They reflected the belief that the throne carried the energy or essence introduced by the visitors. The people believed that the throne glowed with a presence that emerged at dawn, symbolizing the renewal of leadership with each new day. This belief created the idea that kingship was reaffirmed daily by the rising sun. The phrase, "the throne that glowed beneath the dawn," emerged from this belief. It described not a literal glow, but the symbolic renewal of authority that came with each sunrise. The people believed that the leader seated on the throne drew strength from the first light of day. The throne became a point where the energy of the visitors and the energy of the sun converged. This convergence shaped the leader's role as a mediator between the forces that governed the world. As the concept of kingship solidified, the throne became central to political identity. The community saw the throne as the foundation of unity. It reminded them that their leaders were chosen through a lineage that began with the visitors. It reminded them that kingship was not of human origin. It reminded them that the leaders' responsibilities extended beyond the world they could see. When the first pharaohs finally rose, they inherited a symbolic throne that carried centuries of meaning. They inherited a kingship rooted in the belief that leadership came from something beyond humanity. They inherited rituals, symbols, and structures shaped by the chosen individuals who came before them. And they inherited the memory of a moment when beings stepped down from the sky and set the course for a civilization that would carry their influence far into the future. The throne that glowed beneath the dawn was not simply an object. It was the heart of kingship. It carried the memory of the visitors, the responsibility of leadership, and the connection between the human world and the world beyond. It stood as a reminder of the moment when the earliest leaders were chosen, and it guided the pharaohs who followed in their footsteps, shaping the destiny of a land that would become one of the greatest civilizations in history. The early kingship that formed along the Nile carried responsibilities unlike those found in any other emerging civilization. The leaders were not simply required to guide their communities in matters of farming, trade, or conflict. They were expected to embody a connection to forces believed to exist beyond the world that ordinary humans could observe. This connection grew from the memory of the night the visitors descended, and it shaped the leaders' understanding of their place in the world. As time passed, this connection became associated with knowledge that people believed no human should have mastered on their own. These teachings were remembered as whispered lessons from the Sky Lords, guidance that shaped the earliest foundations of Egyptian culture. The chosen individuals who carried these teachings did not describe them as revelations. They described them as insights that surfaced naturally, as though their minds had been prepared to understand concepts that others struggled to grasp. Their communities believed these insights were gifts from the visitors. This belief strengthened the idea that the leaders possessed a form of knowledge that transcended ordinary human experience. The leaders themselves did not claim superiority. They simply fulfilled the role they believed had been given to them. One of the first areas where this knowledge appeared was in the understanding of the Nile cycles. The chosen individuals demonstrated awareness of subtle patterns in the flood levels, seasonal variations, and shifts in the river's behaviour. They recognized signs that foretold changes in the flow and advised their communities accordingly. Their predictions were accurate with a consistency that surprised those around them. This accuracy created a sense that they understood a deeper rhythm of the world. While modern explanations may point to careful observation, the people of the time believed the leaders possessed knowledge taught by the visitors. This understanding of the river extended to the development of early agricultural systems. The chosen individuals instructed their communities to build canals, dikes, and storage pits in ways that optimized the use of floodwaters. These constructions were simple compared to the engineering achievements of later eras, but they represented a significant advancement. The people believed these designs reflected principles taught by the visitors. The leaders did not claim credit for the ideas. They simply explained that the methods aligned with principles they had inherited. This reinforced the belief that they were executing a plan introduced by the beings who stepped down from the sky. The teachings also influenced the development of early settlement planning. The chosen leaders advised their communities to build structures in alignment with certain natural features. Some settlements were oriented toward the rising sun. Others were aligned with specific stars or constellations. These decisions were not arbitrary. The leaders explained that certain alignments brought harmony between the physical world and the unseen forces that governed it. These ideas formed the basis for the later architectural principles that defined Egyptian temples and monuments. The alignment of buildings with celestial events created a sense of stability that strengthened the bond between the people and their environment. The knowledge attributed to the visitors extended into the realm of timekeeping. The chosen individuals encouraged their communities to track the movement of the stars and the changing lengths of shadows. They introduced methods for marking time using simple tools such as stakes, stones, or carved markers. These early techniques allowed communities to anticipate seasonal changes and plan agricultural activities with greater precision. The origins of this timekeeping knowledge were attributed to the visitors, whose understanding of the sky was believed to surpass anything humans could develop on their own. Over generations, these teachings evolved into early forms of astronomy. The people began to associate specific stars with agricultural cycles, religious festivals, and community gatherings. The leaders instructed them to observe the sky regularly, not for entertainment, but to understand the patterns that governed their lives. This practice laid the foundation for the sophisticated astronomical knowledge that later defined Egyptian rituals. The people believed that the visitors had shown their ancestors how to read the sky, and this belief became central to their identity. One of the most significant aspects of the whispered lessons was the understanding of balance and order. The leaders emphasized the importance of maintaining harmony in all aspects of life. They taught that the world functioned according to principles that required equilibrium. This understanding shaped their approach to governance, resource management, and community interactions. Over time, these teachings evolved into the concept of maintaining order, a principle that would later become a cornerstone of Egyptian thought. The chosen individuals also introduced early forms of symbolic communication. They encouraged their communities to use markings to represent ideas, objects, and events. These markings were primitive compared to later hieroglyphs, but they represented the first steps toward written language. The people believed that the visitors had given their ancestors the ability to transform ideas into symbols. This belief elevated the role of writing in society. Writing became associated with knowledge, authority, and continuity. It allowed leaders to preserve teachings and pass them to future generations. As symbolic communication improved, the leaders began recording important events, rituals, and observations. They created early records of flood cycles, harvest yields, and astronomical events. These records helped communities understand the world more effectively. The leaders used them to guide decisions and maintain stability. The people believed that the visitors had shown their ancestors how to preserve knowledge beyond the limits of memory. This belief strengthened the importance of scribes and scholars in society. These individuals became the keepers of knowledge, serving as a bridge between the past and the future. Another area where whispered lessons appeared was in the understanding of medicine. The chosen individuals demonstrated knowledge of healing techniques that seemed advanced for their time. They recognized the properties of certain plants, minerals, and natural substances. They taught their communities how to use these materials to treat injuries, illnesses, and diseases. This knowledge wasn't viewed as superstition. It was seen as practical and effective. The people believed the visitors had taught their ancestors how to care for the body, just as they had taught them how to care for the land. The medicinal knowledge extended beyond treatments. The leaders emphasized the importance of cleanliness, dietary practices, and spiritual well-being. They believed that health required balance between the physical and spiritual aspects of life. These beliefs laid the groundwork for the medical practices that would later emerge in Egypt. The people believed that the visitors had shown their ancestors how to maintain health through harmony and discipline. The whispered lessons also influenced the development of early spiritual practices. The chosen individuals taught their communities that the world was shaped by forces that could not be seen but could be understood through observation and ritual. They introduced practices that encouraged reflection, gratitude, and respect for the natural world. These practices were not associated with specific deities at first. They were associated with the principles taught by the visitors. Over time, these practices evolved into the religious systems that would define Egyptian culture. The leaders encouraged the creation of early shrines or sacred spaces where people could gather to honour the principles introduced by the visitors. These spaces were simple, often consisting of stones arranged in specific patterns or areas designated for rituals. The people believed that these spaces allowed them to connect with the unseen forces that guided their lives. The leaders assured them that these practices aligned with the teachings they had inherited. This belief strengthened the role of sacred spaces in society. As these spiritual practices developed, the leaders taught the people to observe natural signs as messages from the forces that governed the world. They encouraged them to watch the behaviour of animals, the patterns of weather, and the movement of celestial bodies. These observations were interpreted as guidance. The people believed that understanding these signs helped them maintain harmony with the principles introduced by the visitors. This belief shaped the early forms of divination and ritual consultation. Over generations, these teachings influenced the development of early mythologies. Stories began to emerge that described the origins of the world, the nature of the visitors, and the purpose of humanity. These stories were not written at first. They were shared verbally during gatherings, ceremonies, and communal events. The chosen individuals shaped these stories to reflect the teachings they had inherited. They explained that the visitors had introduced principles that guided the world, and that humanity's role was to uphold these principles. These early myths eventually formed the basis for the pantheon that would later define Egyptian religion. The visitors were remembered not as travellers or teachers, but as gods who shaped the world. Their actions were interpreted through symbolic language. Their teachings became associated with specific deities. As the myths expanded, the visitors' influence became woven into the identity of the divine. The people believed that the gods watched over them and guided their leaders, just as the visitors had done. The whispered lessons extended into the development of early craftsmanship. The chosen individuals taught their communities to shape tools, construct buildings, and create decorative objects with precision. They emphasized the importance of symmetry, alignment, and proportion. These principles influenced the development of early art and architecture. The people believed that the visitors had shown their ancestors how to create objects that reflected the harmony of the world. This belief elevated the status of artisans and builders in society. As architectural skills improved, the leaders encouraged the construction of larger and more complex structures. These structures served as gathering places, storage facilities, and ceremonial spaces. They reflected the principles introduced by the visitors. The alignment of these structures with celestial events reinforced the belief that architecture could connect the physical world with the unseen forces that shaped it. This belief laid the foundation for the monumental architecture that would later define Egyptian civilization. The whispered lessons also influenced the development of early governance systems. The leaders emphasized the importance of fairness, responsibility, and stability. They believed that these principles reflected the teachings of the visitors. They encouraged their communities to resolve disputes peacefully, distribute resources equitably, and maintain order. These early governance systems created a sense of unity that strengthened the emerging states along the Nile. Over generations, the leaders expanded their influence by building alliances with neighbouring communities. They used the teachings they inherited to promote cooperation and shared purpose. These alliances eventually formed the basis for the early dynasties. The people believed that the leaders' ability to unify different groups reflected their connection to the visitors. This belief strengthened the legitimacy of their authority. The knowledge attributed to the visitors continued to grow in complexity as the early dynasties formed. The leaders believed they were custodians of a legacy that extended beyond their world. They believed that their responsibility was to preserve the teachings introduced by the visitors and pass them to future generations. This belief shaped their approach to governance, religion, and daily life. It created a sense of continuity that defined the identity of the emerging civilization. As the early dynasties expanded, the teachings attributed to the visitors became integrated into the education of future rulers. They learned about the principles of balance, the importance of observing natural signs, and the need to maintain harmony in all aspects of life. They learned how to interpret celestial events, manage resources, and guide their communities. This education ensured that the leaders would continue the lineage of knowledge established by the chosen individuals. The whispered lessons from the Sky Lords became the foundation for the intellectual, spiritual, and political development of early Egypt. The people believed that their civilization was shaped not only by human effort, but by teachings introduced by beings who existed beyond the limits of ordinary experience. This belief strengthened their identity and provided a sense of purpose that carried their civilization forward. The knowledge no human should have known became the basis for a kingship that reflected principles introduced long before the first pharaoh took the throne. It shaped the way leaders governed, the way people lived, and the way the land was cultivated. It influenced the development of art, architecture, medicine, and timekeeping. It created a legacy that endured through thousands of years. The whispered lessons did not fade with time. They remained embedded in the rituals, symbols, and beliefs that defined Egyptian culture. They shaped the identity of the divine rulers and guided the people who looked to them for stability and guidance. The knowledge introduced by the visitors became inseparable from the identity of the civilization itself, forming the foundation for everything that followed as the kingship evolved and the world along the Nile continued to transform. The rise of early rulers along the Nile brought with it a realization that the teachings inherited from the visitors needed places where they could be preserved, practiced, and passed on without being lost to time. These leaders understood that knowledge spread through words alone might shift with each telling. Memories changed as seasons turned and as generations handed stories from one person to another. The leaders believed that the teachings introduced by the visitors carried principles too important to risk losing. These principles required spaces devoted to the purpose of remembering. Over time, these spaces became the earliest temples, structures that did more than shelter rituals. They became places that held the memory of another world. These early temples did not resemble the grand stone structures that would later rise across Egypt. They were modest at first, formed from wood, clay, and reed. But their simplicity did not diminish their significance. What mattered was not their size or decoration, but the intention behind them. These first temples were built in locations chosen with careful attention. The leaders selected places where they believed the visitors' influence could still be felt. These locations were often high points near the river, areas where the ground seemed unusually steady, or places where celestial alignments were particularly clear. The people believed that these sites held remnants of the night when the visitors descended. The construction of these early temples followed basic principles taught by the chosen leaders. They emphasized alignment with the rising sun or with specific stars that held meaning within the teachings. These alignments were not decorative. They represented the belief that such structures needed to connect the physical world to the patterns that shaped the sky. The leaders explained that the visitors had shown their ancestors how to recognize these patterns, and that duplicating them in the construction of sacred spaces maintained a connection to the teachings. The people accepted this explanation with trust, believing that the alignment helped preserve the memory of the visitors' presence. Inside these early temples, the space was carefully arranged. Objects were placed in specific orientations that reflected ideas the leaders believed were inherited from the visitors. Simple altars, stone fragments, and carved symbols took positions where they could catch the first light of dawn, or where shadows would align with particular shapes during certain times of the year. These careful arrangements allowed the people to observe natural signs during rituals, reinforcing their understanding of balance and harmony. The leaders believed these arrangements reflected the visitors' original teachings about unity between the earth and sky. The rituals performed in these early temples were direct and humble. They involved offerings of grain, water, or small crafted items. The offerings represented gratitude, not worship of specific deities. The people believed that the act of offering helped maintain harmony between their communities and the principles introduced by the visitors. These rituals reinforced the idea that the people's survival depended on their ability to align with the natural order. The chosen leaders guided these rituals with steady hands, ensuring that the teachings were preserved accurately. As communities grew and the early dynasties began forming, the temples expanded. Their construction incorporated more durable materials such as stone and mud brick. These materials allowed the structures to endure longer. With increased stability came increased responsibility. The leaders recognized that the temples needed to reflect not only practical functions, but also symbolic significance. They began incorporating carvings and decorative elements that represented the teachings inherited from the visitors. These carvings did not yet depict specific gods. Instead, they showed patterns of stars, representations of the sun, or shapes that symbolized balance. These decorative elements became an early form of visual language. They preserved knowledge in ways that could be understood even if spoken words changed. The carvings served as reminders of what the visitors emphasized: order, harmony, and the connection between the earth and the sky. People who visited these temples felt a sense of continuity with the past. They believed these structures held the memory of the night the visitors descended, allowing the teachings to remain present even as generations shifted. As the early dynasties became more established, the temples evolved into centers of learning. The chosen leaders recognized that the teachings needed to be studied, not simply preserved. They began training individuals to interpret the carvings, understand celestial patterns, and guide rituals. These individuals became the earliest priests. Their role was not to serve deities at first, but to maintain the continuity of the teachings introduced by the visitors. They learned how to read subtle signs in the environment, how to align structures with celestial events, and how to conduct rituals that preserved harmony. The early priests spent considerable time observing the sky from the temple grounds. They tracked the movement of stars, the phases of the moon, and the shifting position of the sun. Their observations allowed them to predict seasonal changes more accurately. The people believed that this knowledge connected them to the visitors, whose understanding of the sky seemed infinitely greater than their own. These observations became the basis for the development of early calendars, which allowed the leaders to plan agricultural activities with precision. The temples, in this sense, became repositories of practical knowledge that improved daily life. The knowledge preserved in these early temples also influenced the development of early mathematics. The priests learned to measure distances, angles, and proportions. They used these skills to plan construction projects, divide land, and track astronomical events. These measurements were essential for building larger structures that aligned with celestial patterns. The people believed that the visitors had shown their ancestors how to use numbers to understand the world. This belief strengthened the importance of mathematics in early Egyptian culture. The temples became places where numbers were not only tools, but expressions of the harmony believed to govern the world. As architectural techniques advanced, the temples grew in size and complexity. Builders incorporated columns, doorways, and chambers that reflected symbolic arrangements. These elements were arranged to create pathways that guided visitors through a structured journey. The layout of the temples encouraged reflection. Each space represented a step in understanding the connection between the physical and the unseen. The leaders believed that moving through the temple symbolized the journey of understanding the teachings introduced by the visitors. The construction of these temples required collaboration between artisans, priests, and leaders. Each group brought its own skills to the project. Artisans shaped stone and wood with precision. Priests ensured that the layout aligned with celestial patterns. Leaders oversaw the project, ensuring that the structure reflected the teachings accurately. This collaboration created a sense of unity within the community. The people believed that building a temple reflected their commitment to maintaining the connection established long ago. As the temples grew more elaborate, the decorations began to include symbolic representations of the visitors. These representations were not literal depictions. They were abstract forms that suggested a connection to the sky. They included wings, elongated shapes, or patterns that resembled celestial objects. These symbols reflected the belief that the visitors were beings who existed beyond human understanding. The people did not worship these symbols as deities. They saw them as reminders of the connection their leaders carried. Over time, the temples became places where early rulers received formal recognition. The chosen leaders entered the temples during rituals that affirmed their connection to the visitors. These ceremonies were not yet coronations, but they served a similar purpose. They reinforced the idea that leadership required alignment with the teachings preserved in the temples. The people believed that the temples held the memory of the visitors, and that the leader needed to demonstrate understanding of these teachings in order to fulfill their responsibilities. The rituals performed in these temples strengthened the bond between the leader and the community. The leader stood before carvings that represented celestial patterns, placed offerings on altars, and participated in rituals that reflected the principles of balance. These actions reassured the people that the leader remained connected to the teachings. They reinforced trust in the leader's ability to preserve harmony. Over generations, these rituals became formalized. They evolved into ceremonies that would later define the coronation of pharaohs. The temples also became centers for preserving historical records. The early priests recognized the importance of documenting events, teachings, and observations. They created records using symbols carved into stone or drawn on pottery. These records served as references for future generations. They preserved information about floods, harvests, rituals, and decisions made by the leaders. The people believed that the temples held the memory of the world. They trusted that these records would guide them through future challenges. As writing systems grew more complex, the temples became places where scribes were trained. These scribes learned to interpret the symbols carved into the walls and to record new information accurately. They became essential to the functioning of the early state. They maintained records of resources, rituals, and astronomical observations. Their work ensured that the teachings introduced by the visitors remained consistent. The people believed that the scribes played an important role in preserving the connection established by the visitors. The temples also served as places where early science developed. The priests conducted experiments to test theories about the movement of celestial bodies, the behavior of water, and the properties of materials. They observed natural phenomena with precision and recorded their findings. These observations influenced the development of early engineering techniques, medical practices, and construction methods. The people believed that the visitors had shown their ancestors how to understand the world through observation and experimentation. The temples became places where knowledge grew, strengthened by this belief. As the early dynasties grew in power, the temples gained increased significance. They became central to the identity of the state. Leaders consulted the priests for guidance on important decisions. They believed that the temples provided a link to the teachings introduced by the visitors. This belief shaped the development of early law, governance, and social structure. The temples were not separate from daily life. They influenced how people lived, worked, and understood the world. The presence of the temples influenced the development of art and culture. Artists created carvings, pottery, and decorative items inspired by the symbols found in the temples. These items reflected the principles of balance and harmony. They often included representations of celestial patterns or abstract forms that suggested the presence of the visitors. These artistic expressions helped reinforce the teachings that shaped early Egyptian identity. The temples also played a role in diplomacy. Leaders met with representatives from neighbouring regions within temple grounds. These meetings were conducted with rituals that emphasized respect and harmony. The leaders believed that conducting diplomacy within the temples ensured that decisions reflected the teachings introduced by the visitors. This belief strengthened alliances and promoted peace. The temples became symbols of stability and trust. Over time, the temples expanded into large complexes that included courtyards, chambers, and storage areas. These complexes became the administrative centers of the early state. They housed priests, scribes, and artisans who worked together to preserve the teachings. The people believed that these complexes represented the physical embodiment of the connection established by the visitors. They saw them as sacred places where the past and present converged. The temples that remembered another world did not lose their significance as the civilization evolved. They remained central to religious, political, and educational life. They preserved the beliefs introduced by the visitors, ensuring that the teachings continued to guide the people. The temples became places where the memory of the night the visitors descended remained alive, shaping the identity of the society. As generations passed, the temples grew into the monumental structures that later defined Egyptian culture. They rose from the ground with stone columns, intricate carvings, and expansive courtyards. They aligned with celestial events and reflected the principles of balance and harmony. These temples became some of the most enduring symbols of ancient Egypt, standing as reminders of the teachings introduced by the visitors. They preserved the memory of a time when the boundaries between worlds seemed thinner, and when the people believed that knowledge had been shared by beings who existed beyond the world they knew. The temples continued to grow and evolve, becoming places where the people connected with their leaders, their ancestors, and the forces they believed shaped the world. They served as bridges between the human world and the memory of the visitors. They held knowledge that guided the rise of one of the most remarkable civilizations in history. And through their presence, the teachings introduced by the visitors remained alive, shaping the destiny of a land that carried the influence of another world. The Nile did more than carry water from one end of the land to the other. It carried memory. It held layers of time beneath its surface, storing traces of everything that shaped the people who lived along its banks. Those who depended on the river for life understood it not only as a source of nourishment, but as something that seemed to recall events that occurred long before they themselves appeared. The river's consistent rhythm gave the impression of understanding. Its floods and retreats felt like a form of communication. Each year, the river rose as though responding to cycles that existed beyond the reach of human sight. In this way, the Nile became a symbol of continuity, a living thread that tied the earliest communities to the moment when the visitors stepped down from the sky. The belief that the river remembered emerged gradually. People began noticing patterns that seemed too precise to be accidental. The river responded predictably to celestial shifts, aligning with certain movements in the sky. The chosen leaders explained that the river's behavior reflected principles introduced by the visitors. These principles emphasized balance, and the river appeared to follow these principles as though they had been imprinted into its nature. The people accepted this explanation without conflict. They already believed that the world operated under a design that the visitors understood. The river's behavior served as evidence of that design. The people began associating symbols with the river's patterns. These symbols represented qualities they believed were embedded in the fabric of the land. Some symbols marked the beginning of the flood season, others represented the retreat of the waters, or the months when planting should begin. These early symbols were not yet part of a formal writing system, but they reflected an early recognition that the river's cycles carried meaning. The chosen leaders encouraged the use of these symbols as a way to preserve knowledge for future generations. They believed that recording the river's patterns through symbols allowed the community to better align with the principles introduced by the visitors. Over time, these symbols evolved into markers of authority. Leaders who understood the river's cycles were seen as individuals capable of maintaining harmony between the land and the sky. This understanding reinforced their connection to the visitors. The people believed that the leaders' knowledge reflected a deeper alignment with the principles that shaped the world. As the symbols grew more complex, they became associated with the leaders themselves. The leaders were seen as protectors of the river's memory. They ensured that the community interpreted the river's signs accurately. The river's influence on the development of early leadership can be seen in the emergence of ceremonial objects that incorporated river symbols. These objects were crafted from clay, stone, or wood, and often displayed simple lines, curves, or shapes that represented water, flow, and cyclical movement. The use of these symbols in ceremonial context indicated that the people believed the river played a role in determining leadership. The leaders in turn used these objects to communicate with their communities. They presented these symbols during gatherings, reinforcing the belief that their authority was tied to their understanding of the river's behaviour. As the early dynasties began forming, the river's significance expanded. It became associated with concepts that extended beyond seasonal cycles. The leaders believed the river represented the flow of time itself. The river's movement symbolized the path from the past to the future. The chosen individuals taught their communities that the river linked the present world with the moment when the visitors arrived. They believed the river carried the memory of that night forward through generations. This belief shaped the role of the river in rituals and ceremonies. People gathered along its banks to honor their ancestors, celebrate new beginnings, and reaffirm their connection to the teachings introduced by the visitors. The development of early religious practices also reflected the river's influence. The early temples built near the river incorporated symbols that represented the flow of water. These symbols reminded people of the river's role in sustaining life and preserving memory. They also reinforced the belief that the visitors' teachings were reflected in the natural world. The temple rituals often included offerings placed in the river, symbolizing gratitude and the continuation of harmony. These offerings were simple, grains, flowers, or crafted objects, but they carried deep significance. The people believed the river carried these offerings as messages to the unseen forces that shaped their world. The river also played a central role in the development of early mythology. Stories began to circulate about the river's origins. Some believed the river existed before the world took its current form. Others believed the visitors had shaped the river to guide the people. These stories reflected the community's desire to understand the world's structure. They also reinforced the idea that the river's memory extended beyond human experience. The river's continuous flow served as a reminder that time moved forward even as the world changed. As the chosen leaders continued their work, they encouraged the development of symbols that represented not only the river's behaviour, but also the qualities associated with leadership. These symbols included representations of balance, strength, and stability. The leaders believed that these qualities were essential for maintaining harmony. They taught their communities that a leader needed to embody these qualities in order to guide the people effectively. Over time, these symbols became part of the regalia associated with leadership. They appeared on ceremonial objects, clothing, and structures. They reminded the people that the leader carried the responsibility of preserving the connection between the world and the visitors' teachings. The river's role in shaping leadership extended into the development of early architecture. Builders began designing structures that reflected the river's patterns. They used curved lines to represent the flow of water and symmetrical arrangements to represent balance. These design principles influenced the construction of early public buildings. They also influenced the layout of the early capitals that would eventually form the centres of the dynasties. The chosen leaders believed these design choices helped maintain harmony between the physical world and the principles introduced by the visitors. As the early dynasties grew in power, the river's importance continued to expand. It became a central symbol of the state. The leaders used the river as a metaphor for their role in guiding the people. They explained that just as the river provided nourishment, leadership provided guidance. They believed that their ability to interpret the river's patterns reflected their connection to the visitors. This belief strengthened their authority and helped unify the people under a shared identity. The river's role in unification was particularly important. As different communities along the Nile began coming together, the river served as a shared reference point. It provided common ground for understanding the world. The chosen leaders used this shared understanding to bring communities into alignment. They explained that the river connected all the people of the land. It flowed through each community, shaping their lives and linking their futures. This belief helped bridge cultural differences and created a sense of unity that strengthened the early dynasties. The symbols associated with the river became more complex as the dynasties grew. They began to appear in early writing systems, where they represented concepts related to flow, time, authority, and life. These symbols became essential to the development of royal iconography. They appeared on ceremonial clothing, scepters, and early forms of crowns. They represented the leader's role in maintaining harmony. They also represented the leader's connection to the teachings introduced by the visitors. These symbols reminded the people that leadership was not simply a human invention. It was part of a larger design that extended beyond their world. The river's influence extended into early burial practices. The chosen individuals believed that the river carried the memory of their ancestors. They believed that burial sites located near the river allowed the spirits of the deceased to remain connected to the world. This belief shaped the placement of early cemeteries. These cemeteries often included symbols carved into stone markers. These symbols represented the river, the passage of time, and the journey of the soul. The people believed that these markers helped guide the deceased into the next cycle of existence. As construction techniques improved, the burial sites incorporated more elaborate structures. These structures reflected the belief that the river served as a bridge between worlds. They included chambers, corridors, and decorated surfaces that represented the flow of life and the connection between past and present. These early burial structures laid the foundation for the elaborate tombs seen in later dynasties. They represented the belief that the leader's connection to the visitors continued even after death. The people believed that the leader's spirit remained aligned with the principles introduced by the visitors. The river's symbolic influence also shaped early forms of art. Artists created representations of the river using lines, curves, and motifs that suggested movement. These representations appeared on pottery, jewellery, and ceremonial objects. They reflected the belief that the river held a living presence. They also reminded the people that their lives were shaped by patterns far older than the civilization itself. The symbols of the river became part of the cultural identity of the early dynasties, influencing artistic expression for generations. The river influenced early trade practices as well. The chosen leaders recognized that the river provided a natural route for transporting goods. They encouraged trade between communities, promoting cooperation and shared prosperity. The people believed that the river facilitated this exchange, not only because of its physical flow, but because of the memory it carried. They believed that the river helped maintain unity by reminding people of their shared origins. This belief strengthened the economic foundation of the early dynasties. As the dynasties continued to evolve, the temples, administrative centres, and burial sites became more elaborate. But no matter how complex these structures became, the river remained at the heart of the civilization. It continued to shape the beliefs, rituals, and daily practices of the people. The leaders continued to view the river as a source of wisdom. They believed that understanding the river's patterns allowed them to govern effectively. The people believed that the river preserved the memory of the visitors, and that this memory guided their leaders. This belief remained central even as the civilization expanded far beyond its early settlements. The river continued to flow, carrying with it the symbols of power older than Egypt itself. These symbols shaped the identity of the rulers, the structure of society, and the worldview of the people. They reminded everyone that their civilization was built upon teachings introduced by beings whose influence endured long after their departure. The river never forgot. It carried the memory of the night the visitors descended. It carried the symbols that shaped the earliest expressions of leadership. It carried the patterns that guided the rise of the dynasties. And through its continuous flow, it preserved the legacy that defined the identity of a land destined to become one of the world's greatest civilizations. The rise of early Egypt did not unfold only through the hands of the rulers who guided their people, or the farmers who shaped the land along the Nile. It was also influenced by tools and objects that appeared during the earliest stages of the civilization. These tools didn't simply serve practical purposes. They carried stories within them, reflecting knowledge believed to have originated from the visitors who stepped down from the sky, long before the first dynasties emerged. The people who used these tools didn't fully understand how some of them came to exist, but they recognized that the tools held importance beyond their immediate function. As the centuries passed, these objects became symbols of a legacy older than the civilization itself. Some of the earliest tools discovered near the settlements along the Nile displayed a level of craftsmanship that stood apart from the ordinary work of the time. They were made with precision not commonly found in early societies. Their shape suggested a deep understanding of geometry. Their edges reflected techniques that were difficult to achieve with the limited resources available. The chosen leaders believed these tools represented teachings introduced by the visitors. The people accepted this view, believing that the tools were part of a larger framework that shaped the early development of their culture. These early tools influenced construction techniques. Builders used them to measure distances, carve materials, and shape the foundation of structures that would later become temples and administrative centres. The accuracy achieved with these tools allowed the builders to create alignments with celestial patterns. The people saw this precision as evidence of the visitors' influence. They believed the visitors had shown their ancestors how to create tools that connected the physical world to the sky. Over time, certain tools became associated with leadership. The chosen individuals carried tools that represented their understanding of the visitors' teachings. These tools symbolized authority as well as function. They served as reminders that the leaders guided their communities using principles introduced by the beings who descended. The people believed these tools allowed the leaders to interpret the world accurately. They trusted that the tools carried a form of inherited knowledge. Some tools found in early burial sites suggest that the chosen individuals were buried with objects considered essential for continuing their responsibilities in the next cycle of existence. These tools were placed carefully alongside the bodies, reflecting the belief that the leader's knowledge extended beyond life. The people believed that the tools connected the deceased to the teachings they carried during their lifetime. These burial practices reveal the significance of the tools in early Egyptian culture. They were not simply instruments of labour, they symbolized a connection to the origins of leadership. The tools found in ceremonial contexts often included carvings that reflected celestial patterns. These carvings did not explain the purpose of the tools directly. They provided clues about the beliefs associated with them. The chosen leaders believed the visitors emphasized harmony between the earth and the sky. The carvings on the tools reminded people of this principle. They represented the understanding that the tools served a role in maintaining alignment between the physical world and the patterns introduced by the visitors. As construction techniques advanced, new tools appeared. These tools displayed features that suggested deliberate design choices. They allowed builders to create sharper angles, smoother surfaces, and more precise measurements. The people believed these advancements reflected continued adherence to the principles taught by the visitors. The chosen leaders encouraged the use of these tools in projects that required careful planning. They explained that the visitors' teachings remained relevant as the population expanded and the buildings grew larger. The presence of these advanced tools influenced the development of early workshops. Artisans gathered in spaces designated for shaping materials. These workshops became centres of innovation. The chosen leaders occasionally visited to observe the work and ensure that the tools were used in accordance with the teachings they believed they had inherited. These interactions strengthened the connection between leadership and craftsmanship. The people believed that skilled artisans played a role in preserving the visitors' influence. Their work helped maintain the sense of order and harmony that defined early Egyptian society. Some tools were crafted with alloys that puzzled later observers. These alloys displayed properties not typically found in the region during the early dynastic period. The presence of these alloys suggested trade or advanced knowledge of metallurgy. The chosen leaders believed the visitors had shown their ancestors how to create materials with unique properties. These materials were used in ceremonial objects and in tools associated with leadership. The unusual properties of the alloys reinforced the belief that the tools carried a connection to something beyond ordinary human experience. As the early temples expanded, the tools used in their construction became symbols in their own right. The people believed the tools preserved the principles introduced by the visitors. They treated them with respect, storing them in designated areas when not in use. Some tools were believed to hold protective qualities. They were placed in specific locations within the temples to ensure balance and stability. These practices reflected the belief that the tools had a role beyond construction. They held meaning connected to the teachings that shaped the early civilization. Over generations, some tools became associated with myths. Stories emerged describing how the visitors had introduced certain tools to the chosen individuals. These stories explained that the tools allowed the leaders to understand the natural world with clarity. The myths emphasized the connection between the visitors and the leaders. They suggested that the visitors had left behind objects that contained hints of their knowledge. The people believed these tools helped shape the early development of their culture. The myths influenced the rituals performed in the temples. The chosen leaders incorporated the tools into ceremonies that affirmed their connection to the visitors. They presented the tools during gatherings, explaining their significance to the community. These presentations reinforced the belief that the tools represented a legacy of knowledge. The people accepted this explanation, believing that the tools played a role in preserving the connection established during the Night of Descent. Some tools were believed to carry protective qualities. People placed them in strategic locations within their homes to promote harmony and stability. These practices reflected the belief that the tools absorbed or radiated energy associated with the visitors' teachings. The people believed that keeping these tools close helped maintain the balance necessary for daily life. These beliefs shaped the use of tools in contexts far beyond their practical functions. The tools also influenced the development of early measurement systems. The chosen leaders encouraged their communities to use standard units of measurement based on principles they believed were introduced by the visitors. These early measurement systems allowed for consistent construction, trade, and agricultural planning. The people believed the tools helped them understand the world in a structured way. They saw the tools as embodiments of the principles introduced by the visitors. Some tools featured markings that resembled early writing symbols. These markings indicated ownership, purpose, or alignment with celestial events. The chosen leaders believed these markings strengthened the connection between the material world and the teachings introduced by the visitors. The people viewed these markings as signs of the tool's importance. They believed the markings preserved meaning that extended beyond the lifetime of the individual who created or used the tool. As the early dynasties expanded, the tools became symbols of authority. The leaders used them in ceremonies that marked the beginning of their responsibilities. These ceremonies emphasized the connection between leadership and craftsmanship. The tools represented the leaders' ability to shape their communities in accordance with the teachings they had inherited. The people believed that the tools allowed the leaders to act with clarity and purpose. They accepted these ceremonies as essential for maintaining harmony within the state. The tools also influenced the development of early art. Artists used them to create carvings, reliefs, and decorative patterns that reflected concepts introduced by the visitors. These artistic expressions helped reinforce the connection between the physical objects and the teachings they represented. The people believed that the art created with these tools carried meaning that extended beyond its visual impact. They believed the art preserved knowledge and served as a reminder of the visitors' influence. Over time, some tools were revered as relics. They were passed down through generations, protected and preserved as part of the community's legacy. These tools became symbols of continuity. The people believed they carried the memory of the early leaders who shaped the foundations of their civilization. They believed that using these tools allowed them to maintain a connection to the principles introduced long ago. The presence of these tools in early burial sites suggests that they held personal significance for the leaders. They were buried with the tools to ensure that the leaders carried their responsibilities into the next life. These burial practices reflected the belief that leadership extended beyond physical existence. The people believed the leaders' connection to the visitors continued after death. They believed the tools helped preserve this connection. As the civilization grew more complex, the tools influenced the development of early law. The leaders incorporated symbols derived from the tools into legal documents. These symbols represented stability, balance, and fairness. The people believed the tools provided a foundation for justice. They accepted the symbols as representations of the principles introduced by the visitors. These symbols helped shape the early legal system. Some tools featured designs that encouraged the development of early engineering techniques. These techniques allowed builders to create structures with increasing complexity. The people believed that the tools contained hints of the visitors' knowledge, guiding the development of new methods. These advancements contributed to the growth of the temples, administrative centers, and early capitals of the dynasties. The tools also influenced the development of early agriculture. Farmers used them to cultivate the land, plant crops, and manage irrigation systems. These practices improved food production, supporting population growth and stability. The people believed the tools helped them understand the land more effectively. They believed that the visitors had introduced the principles that guided agricultural success. The tools that outlived their makers carried meaning long after their creators passed away. They preserved the knowledge introduced by the visitors, shaped the development of the early state, and influenced the growth of art, architecture, governance, and agriculture. These tools became symbols of continuity, connecting the present to the ancient past. The people believed that the tools represented a legacy older than the civilization itself. They carried the memory of a moment when the world changed, guiding the rise of a society shaped by teachings that originated beyond the land they called home. The rise of the chosen leaders created a structure that brought stability to the early communities along the Nile, but stability carried its own challenges. As generations passed, the connection between the leaders and the visitors faded from direct memory and existed only in the stories carried through rituals, symbols, and the teachings preserved in the temples. The people still believed that the leaders inherited their authority from the beings who stepped down from the sky, but human nature, shaped by ambition, uncertainty, and desire, began to influence how individuals perceived their place within this structure. This shift did not occur suddenly. It unfolded slowly, quietly, becoming a silent rebellion that reshaped the future of leadership in Egypt. In the earliest days, the chosen individuals guided their communities with humility. They believed their role originated from the moment when the visitors descended. They acted with an awareness of the responsibility they carried. Over generations, however, the memory of that moment softened. The descendants of the chosen leaders grew up in a world where their authority was already established. They inherited symbols, tools, and rituals without witnessing the events that gave them meaning. The leaders continued to guide their people with the teachings they inherited, but their understanding of those teachings became influenced by their own interpretations and experiences. The people who lived during this time continued to believe in the divine origins of leadership, but they could no longer rely on first-hand accounts. Their understanding came from the stories passed down by their elders and the symbols preserved in the temples. As the dynasties grew more complex, individuals began to view leadership not only as a sacred duty, but also as a position that offered influence, security, and recognition. These human desires introduced tension into the structure of leadership. Individuals who were not part of the chosen lineage began to imagine what it would mean to hold the throne themselves. This growing desire did not manifest as open rebellion. It appeared first in subtle shifts of behavior. Individuals outside the chosen lineage began taking on responsibilities previously reserved for those who inherited their roles. They demonstrated competence in managing resources, organizing labor, and interpreting signs in the environment. Their actions were not attempts to undermine authority. They were attempts to contribute to the growing complexity of the society. But as these individuals gained recognition from their communities, they began to imagine the possibility of rising to positions traditionally reserved for the descendants of the chosen leaders. The chosen leaders noticed the increasing influence of these individuals. At first, they welcomed the assistance. They saw the value in allowing more people to contribute to the development of the civilization. Their responsibilities had grown beyond the capacity of a small group. They needed advisors, administrators, and artisans who understood the principles introduced by the visitors. But the chosen leaders also recognized that this shift carried risks. The more individuals grew in influence, the more they began to see themselves as potential successors. This gradual shift created tension within the early dynasties. Individuals outside the chosen lineage began forming alliances. These alliances were not formed with the intention of challenging the leaders. They were formed to strengthen trade, coordinate construction projects, and develop administrative systems. But these alliances created networks of support that could be used for other purposes. The chosen leaders saw the potential for these networks to influence succession and leadership. They understood that their authority rested on a belief that could be weakened if others gained sufficient influence. Despite these concerns, the chosen leaders continued to work with the individuals who demonstrated exceptional skill. They believed that excluding others would undermine the principles introduced by the visitors. They valued cooperation and unity. This openness allowed the civilization to flourish, but it also created opportunities for individuals to gain access to the teachings preserved in the temples. As more people gained knowledge, the distinction between the chosen lineage and the rest of the population began to blur. The silent rebellion gained strength when certain individuals outside the chosen lineage began interpreting the teachings in new ways. These interpretations were not intended to challenge the principles. They were attempts to expand understanding. But as the teachings evolved, the people began to view knowledge as a path to authority. Knowledge had once been the domain of the chosen leaders. It had given them the ability to guide their communities. Now, knowledge became a source of influence for others as well. This shift created a subtle but significant change in how leadership was perceived. The people began to question whether authority depended solely on the lineage of the chosen individuals, or whether it could also come from those who demonstrated exceptional understanding of the teachings. This questioning did not lead to immediate conflict. It existed beneath the surface, shaping the thoughts of individuals who sought greater influence. As the early dynasties grew larger, the structures of governance became more complex. Administrators, priests, and scribes played important roles in managing the affairs of the state. Their growing influence made it possible for individuals outside the chosen lineage to gain authority in specific areas. This authority strengthened their confidence. It allowed them to envision a future where leadership was not determined solely by lineage. They began to see themselves as potential successors to roles traditionally held by the descendants of the visitors' chosen ones. The chosen leaders recognized this shift and began implementing measures to reinforce their authority. They emphasized the rituals that affirmed their connection to the visitors. They highlighted the symbols that represented their lineage. They increased the use of ceremonies to remind the people of their sacred role. These actions were not attempts to suppress others. They were attempts to preserve the structure that had guided their ancestors. The chosen leaders believed that the stability of the civilization depended on continuity with the teachings introduced by the visitors. Despite these efforts, the desire for influence continued to grow among individuals outside the chosen lineage. They observed the chosen leaders closely, learning how they conducted rituals, interpreted signs, and made decisions. They believed that with sufficient knowledge they could fulfill the responsibilities of leadership. This belief did not undermine the teachings themselves. It reflected a shift in how people understood the path to authority. They no longer saw leadership as a role bestowed solely by the visitors. They began to see it as something that could be earned. As the silent rebellion grew, conflicts emerged within the early temples. Priests from the chosen lineage sometimes disagreed with priests who had risen through skill and study. These disagreements centered on interpretations of the teachings and the proper conduct of rituals. The chosen priests believed their lineage gave them the authority to interpret the teachings. The others believed their knowledge gave them equal standing. These disputes rarely escalated into open conflict. They were resolved through discussion, compromise, and ritual. but they revealed the growing tension between lineage and knowledge. This tension influenced the development of early laws. The chosen leaders introduced legal codes that reinforced the importance of lineage in maintaining stability. These laws emphasized the sacred nature of leadership. They outlined responsibilities reserved for the chosen lineage. They clarified the roles of administrators and priests. But these laws could not eliminate the desire for influence. They simply created a framework that individuals needed to navigate carefully. The silent rebellion also influenced the development of early art and symbolism. Artists began incorporating symbols that represented the importance of knowledge alongside symbols that represented lineage. This shift reflected the growing recognition of the contributions made by individuals outside the chosen lineage. The art created during this period captured the dynamic nature of the civilization. It preserved both the traditions established by the chosen leaders and the expanding influence of those who sought greater roles. As time passed, certain individuals outside the chosen lineage gained enough influence to shape major decisions. They advised the leaders on matters related to trade, construction, and diplomacy. Their contributions strengthened the civilization. They helped improve agricultural practices, develop new technologies, and expand the reach of the early dynasties. These accomplishments gave them recognition within their communities. They became respected figures whose voices carried weight. The chosen leaders understood that these individuals played essential roles. They valued their contributions. But they also recognized that the increasing influence of these individuals threatened the traditional structure. The leaders faced a challenge that required careful judgment. They needed to maintain continuity with the teachings introduced by the visitors while managing the ambitions of those who sought greater influence. This challenge became more complex as the population grew and the early capitals expanded. The leaders could no longer rely solely on lineage to maintain unity. They needed to incorporate individuals of exceptional skill into positions of authority. They needed to adapt the structure of leadership to reflect the evolving needs of the civilization. This adaptation required a balance between honoring the lineage of the chosen leaders and recognizing the contributions of those who shaped the civilization's progress. The silent rebellion gained new momentum when individuals outside the chosen lineage began forming alliances with other influential groups. These alliances allowed them to shape decisions collectively. They developed strategies for managing resources, organizing labor, and conducting trade. These actions provided them with the experience necessary to guide large communities. They believed they were capable of fulfilling roles traditionally reserved for the chosen lineage. The chosen leaders responded by reinforcing their connection to the visitors' teachings. They organized rituals that emphasized the importance of maintaining harmony. They reminded the people that the lineage of leadership carried a legacy shaped by the night the visitors descended. They believed that the people needed to remember the origins of leadership. They believed that losing this connection would disrupt the stability of the civilization. Despite these efforts, the silent rebellion could not be reversed. It had become part of the natural evolution of the society. The emergence of new leaders from outside the chosen lineage reflected the expanding complexity of the civilization. It demonstrated that knowledge, skill, and ambition could shape the structure of leadership. The chosen leaders accepted this reality gradually. They recognized that the civilization needed individuals who possessed a deep understanding of the teachings introduced by the visitors, regardless of their lineage. This acceptance did not diminish the importance of the chosen lineage. It allowed the civilization to incorporate new perspectives while preserving the foundational principles. The silent rebellion led to the development of a more flexible structure of leadership. It created opportunities for individuals from diverse backgrounds to contribute to the state. It encouraged the growth of institutions that preserved knowledge. It strengthened the ability of the leaders to guide their people. The silent rebellion also influenced the development of early myths. Stories emerged describing conflicts between leaders who inherited their roles and individuals who sought them through knowledge. These stories did not portray the conflict as destructive. They portrayed it as part of the natural progression of the world. They emphasized the importance of balance between lineage and skill. They suggested that leadership needed to reflect both inheritance and merit. These myths eventually became part of the symbolic language of the civilization. They were depicted in early carvings and ceremonial objects. They served as reminders that leadership required both tradition and innovation. They reflected the understanding that the civilization needed leaders who could preserve the teachings introduced by the visitors while adapting to changing circumstances. As the early dynasties continued to evolve, the silent rebellion shaped the identity of the state. It influenced the development of governance, religion, and social structure. It encouraged the integration of diverse perspectives into leadership. It strengthened the ability of the state to adapt to new challenges. It allowed the civilization to grow in ways that honored the legacy of the visitors while embracing human potential. This silent rebellion did not overthrow the throne. It transformed it. It ensured that leadership reflected the complexity of a civilization shaped by teachings from another world. It demonstrated that the desire for influence and recognition could coexist with the responsibility to maintain harmony. It preserved the stability of the early dynasties while allowing the civilization to expand its understanding of leadership. And through this quiet transformation, the civilization continued to grow, carrying forward the memory of the night when the visitors descended and the lineage that began shaping the destiny of Egypt. The emergence of temples, the growth of symbols, and the rise of a more flexible structure of leadership all carried the civilization into a period where knowledge became as essential as the river itself. With each generation, the people along the Nile recognized that the teachings inherited from the visitors needed guardians, individuals capable of protecting, organizing, and interpreting the ideas that shaped their world. These guardians did not appear suddenly. They emerged slowly, beginning as observers, recorders, and advisors. In time, they grew into a class of scribes and scholars who devoted their lives to studying the patterns preserved in the temples, the symbols carved into stone, and the behaviors of the world around them. They became seekers of meaning, searching through sand, stars, and memory for traces of the beings who once walked beside their ancestors. The development of writing systems created new opportunities for understanding. Early carvings had expressed ideas in simple forms, but as the civilization expanded, these forms became more sophisticated. Scribes learned how to combine symbols in ways that conveyed detailed information. They recorded events, catalogued resources, and preserved teachings that had once been carried only through speech. Their work allowed the civilization to maintain continuity even as the population grew and new responsibilities emerged. These written records ensured that knowledge did not fade with memory. They allowed individuals to study ideas that originated long before their time. The scribes understood the importance of their work. They recognized that writing preserved more than practical information. It preserved echoes of the teachings introduced by the visitors. Each symbol, each line, each carved surface represented a connection to the past. The scribes treated their work with respect, believing they were carrying forward a legacy that shaped the foundations of their world. Their role placed them in contact with the leaders, the priests, and the artisans who contributed to the development of the civilization. They became essential to the functioning of the early dynasties. As the scribes recorded information on stone, pottery, and early forms of writing surfaces, they began noticing patterns. These patterns appeared in the rituals conducted in the temples, in the alignments of structures, and in the teachings that had been preserved through generations. The scribes recognized that the principles guiding their civilization were consistent. They appeared in multiple contexts, shaping everything from construction to agriculture. This consistency suggested that the teachings had a unified origin. The scribes believed that understanding these patterns would allow them to uncover the deeper meaning behind the visitors' influence. The scholars emerged from the ranks of the scribes. They were individuals who demonstrated an exceptional ability to interpret the patterns preserved in the records. They studied the symbols carefully, identifying connections between different aspects of the civilization. The scholars recognized that the teachings extended beyond practical knowledge. They contained insights about the structure of the world. These insights shaped the scholars' understanding of their place within the civilization. They believed their work allowed them to approach the perspective of the visitors who had understood the world more deeply than humans. Some scholars dedicated their lives to studying the oldest records. These records contained references to the night the visitors descended, preserved through symbols and early forms of writing. The scholars believed that these records held clues about the visitors' nature and intentions. They examined the symbols with great care, interpreting subtle variations that preserved aspects of the teachings. Their work allowed them to reconstruct ideas that had been lost through memory. They believed they were uncovering fingerprints left behind by the visitors. As the scholars continued their work, they began studying the landscape itself. They observed the placement of temples, the orientation of structures, and the layout of early capitals. They believed that the builders had followed principles introduced by the visitors. The scholars studied the way light entered sacred spaces, the patterns of shadows during specific seasons, and the alignment of structures with celestial events. Each observation revealed a new detail, strengthening their belief that the visitors had influenced the design of the early civilization. The scholars viewed these details as evidence that the visitors' teachings were embedded in the physical world. The sand became one of the scholars' greatest tools. It covered ancient structures, concealed early settlements, and preserved objects that reflected the first expressions of the visitors' influence. The scholars understood that the sand held memories of the past. They carefully removed layers of sand to uncover objects that had remained hidden for centuries. These objects included early tools, ceramic fragments, and pieces of writing surfaces. Each discovery allowed the scholars to reconstruct the history of the civilization. They believed the sand preserved the fingerprints of the visitors. The scholars recognized that the sand changed with time. It moved with the wind, shifted during floods, and covered new areas with each season. These changes preserve the past while also obscuring it. The scholars learned to read the sand as though it were a text. They examined its layers, identifying the periods when structures had been built, buried, and rebuilt. This understanding allowed them to reconstruct the timeline of their civilization. They believed the sand helped them understand how the teachings had evolved through generations. The search for the visitors' influence shaped the work of the scholars. They believed the teachings contained ideas that extended beyond their immediate world. These ideas appeared in the structure of the writing system, the design of the temples, and the patterns observed in nature. The scholars studied astronomical records, tracking the movement of stars and planets. They believed the visitors had understood these movements with clarity. The scholars attempted to replicate this understanding through careful observation. Their work allowed them to anticipate seasonal changes, interpret celestial events, and guide agricultural planning. The scholars also studied natural materials. They examined stones used in construction, identifying patterns that suggested deliberate selection. They studied the properties of metals, understanding how heat and pressure affected their behavior. These studies allowed them to replicate techniques used by earlier generations. The scholars believed that certain materials held symbolic significance. They believed the visitors had introduced the knowledge necessary to shape these materials effectively. Their work preserved these techniques, ensuring that future generations continue to benefit from this understanding. The relationship between the scholars and the leaders grew stronger as the dynasties expanded. The leaders relied on the scholars to interpret the signs that guided important decisions. The scholars provided information about the flood cycles, the movement of the stars, and the structure of the land. Their knowledge supported the stability of the state, allowing the leaders to govern effectively. This relationship reinforced the scholars' importance within the civilization. They became advisors whose work shaped the direction of the early dynasties. Some scholars specialized in the study of early myths. They examined stories shared during rituals, gatherings, and ceremonies. These stories described the origins of the world, the nature of the visitors, and the role of humanity within the larger design. The scholars compared different versions of the stories, identifying common elements. They believed these elements reflected aspects of the visitors' teachings. Their work allowed them to distinguish between symbolic representations and literal events. They believed understanding these distinctions would help preserve the integrity of the teachings. The scholars' interest in mythology led them to study early art. They examined carvings, pottery, and decorative objects, identifying patterns that reflected symbolic ideas. They recognized that certain shapes, forms, and motifs appeared consistently across different artifacts. These patterns suggested shared beliefs. The scholars believed these beliefs originated from the teachings introduced by the visitors. Their work allowed them to understand the role of art in preserving knowledge. They believed art captured ideas in forms that could survive long after spoken words faded. The scribes supported the scholars by recording their findings. They documented the scholars' interpretations, observations, and theories. These records became essential for preserving knowledge. They ensured that future generations could study the work of earlier scholars. They strengthened the connection between the past and the present. The scribes recognized that their work contributed to a cycle of learning that extended across generations. As the scribes and scholars continued their work, they developed systems for organizing knowledge. They categorized information based on subject matter, creating early forms of archives. These archives became essential for preserving the civilization's intellectual heritage. They allowed individuals to study the teachings systematically. They strengthened the role of the scholars in guiding the direction of the early state. The search for the visitors' fingerprints extended into the realm of medicine. Scholars studied the properties of plants, minerals, and natural substances, identifying treatments for illnesses. They documented the effect of these substances, comparing results across different cases. These studies allowed them to develop early forms of medical knowledge. The scholars believed that understanding health required harmony between the physical and spiritual aspects of life. They believed the visitors had understood this harmony. Their work attempted to replicate this understanding. The scholars also studied the behavior of animals, recognizing patterns that provided insights into the world's structure. They observed migrations, mating rituals, and feeding habits. These observations contributed to their understanding of the natural world. They believed the visitors had introduced principles that governed these behaviors. The scholars sought to understand these principles, believing that doing so would help preserve harmony within the civilization. As the scribes recorded the scholars' work, they developed new forms of writing to capture complex ideas. These forms allowed them to express abstract concepts more clearly. They enabled the preservation of theories about the structure of the world, the movement of celestial bodies, and the nature of the teachings introduced by the visitors. The evolution of writing strengthened the connection between knowledge and leadership. It allowed the leaders to make decisions based on information preserved across generations. The scholars recognized that their work carried a responsibility. They believed they needed to preserve the teachings with accuracy. They understood that misinterpretation could lead to instability. They approached their work with patience, caution, and dedication. They believed they were the custodians of the civilization's intellectual heritage. Their work allowed them to maintain a connection to the moment when the visitors stepped down from the sky. The search for the visitors' influence shaped the identity of the scribes and scholars. They believed their work allowed them to understand the world more deeply. They believed they were following a path established long ago. This belief gave their work meaning. It connected their efforts to the larger story of the civilization. The sand continued to hold discoveries. Each layer removed revealed new insights. Each object uncovered contributed to the scholar's understanding. Each symbol carved into stone carried echoes of the visitors' teachings. The scribes and scholars believed they were uncovering the fingerprints of the gods. They believed the world held traces of the beings who shaped their civilization. And as they continued their work, they strengthened the foundations of a society that carried forward a legacy far older than its own people. The early dynasties carried Egypt into an era where stories, numbers, and structures began to merge in ways that shaped the identity of the Old Kingdom. The civilization that rose along the Nile did not grow solely through the efforts of rulers, scribes, artisans, or scholars. It grew through the continuous blending of myth and measurement, through the interaction between belief and observation, and through the gradual realization that the world contained patterns connecting the past to the present. These patterns appeared in the design of temples, the orientation of monuments, the layout of early capitals, and the rituals that mark the passing of seasons. The people who lived during this time believed these patterns reflected the teachings introduced by the visitors. Myth evolved into a language that helped the people understand their world. It preserved memories of the night the visitors descended, shaping the symbols and stories that defined early culture. Myth was not viewed as contradiction to reality. It was seen as part of the same structure. The stories did not challenge the observations of the scholars. They supported them, providing a framework for interpreting the natural and celestial patterns recorded in the temples. The people believed that myth carried meaning that complemented the measurements made by the scribes and scholars. The scholars recognized that myth played an important role in preserving the teachings. They studied myth with the same attention they applied to recorded measurements. They identified patterns within the stories that aligned with astronomical cycles. These patterns revealed connections between the stories shared during rituals and the observations made during the changing seasons. The scholars believed that the visitors had introduced both myth and measurement to help the early civilization understand the world. They saw the two systems as intertwined, each revealing aspects of the larger design. Measurement became a foundation for the advancement of early architecture. The builders used consistent units to ensure that their structures aligned properly with celestial patterns. These measurements were not arbitrary. They were derived from principles preserved through writing and taught by the scholars. The builders understood that precise measurements were essential for maintaining harmony between the structures and the natural world. They believed that alignment created stability. They believed that the visitors had emphasized the importance of maintaining balance. The builders who worked on early temples and administrative centers often consulted the scholars. They sought advice on the position of the sun, the behavior of shadows, and the movement of the stars. These consultations allowed the builders to design structures that aligned with celestial events. The scholars believed that these alignments preserved the teachings introduced by the visitors. The people believed that the structures reflected the order that governed the world. As the builders gained experience, the structures they created became increasingly complex. Columns, chambers, and corridors were designed using mathematical principles preserved by the scribes. These principles reflected the belief that understanding numbers allowed individuals to understand the world more fully. The builders believed that their work connected the present to the past. They believed the structures they created preserved the hidden lines that shaped the early dynasties. The hidden lines were not visible in a literal sense. They were the relationships between angles, distances, and celestial alignments. They were the patterns that emerged when builders examined the movement of shadows or the path of the stars. These lines shaped the placement of doorways, the orientation of walls, and the height of columns. The builders believed these lines reflected principles introduced by the visitors. The scholars taught that aligning structures with these hidden lines helped preserve harmony within the civilization. As the Old Kingdom approached, the hidden lines became central to the design of monumental structures. The builders recognized that the principles used in early temples could be applied on a larger scale. They used the same units of measurement, the same methods for observing celestial events, and the same principles of alignment. These techniques allowed them to construct larger temples, administrative centers, and ceremonial spaces. The scholars documented these projects carefully, believing they reflected the teachings introduced by the visitors. The rise of the Old Kingdom brought new opportunities for integrating myth into the structures. The builders incorporated motifs that represented the stories preserved in the temples. They carved symbols into the walls, creating visual references to myths that describe the origins of the world. They believed that the stories carried meaning that guided the structure of the civilization. The scholars supported this belief, emphasizing the importance of preserving the teachings through both writing and architecture. The hidden lines influenced the design of early capitals. These capitals were laid out using principles that reflected the flow of the river, the movement of the stars, and the structure of the land. The scholars studied the landscape carefully, identifying natural features that aligned with celestial events. The builders incorporated these features into the design of the capitals. The people believed that the layout reflected the teachings introduced by the visitors. They believed that walking through the capitals allowed them to experience the structure of the world. The scholars believed that understanding the hidden lines allowed them to understand the intentions of the visitors. They studied the temples and monuments, identifying alignments that reflected the visitors' teachings. They documented the movement of the sun through the structures, noting how light interacted with doorways and chambers. They described how shadows shifted during specific times of the year. These observations revealed patterns that supported the stories preserved in myth. The scholars believed that myth and measurement were two aspects of the same system. The hidden lines also influenced early forms of navigation. The scholars used celestial patterns to guide travel and trade. They recognized that certain stars rose and set at predictable times. They taught the leaders how to use these patterns to guide exploration. These techniques strengthened the ability of the early dynasties to expand their influence. The people believed that the visitors had introduced the principles that allowed them to navigate effectively. They trusted the scholars to interpret these principles. The integration of myth and measurement shaped the early educational systems. The scribes taught students to read symbols, record measurements, and interpret celestial events. The scholars taught students to understand the stories preserved in the temples. These lessons helped prepare new generations to continue the work of preserving the teachings introduced by the visitors. The students believed that their education connected them to the origins of their civilization. They approached their work with respect, recognizing the importance of maintaining the connection between myth and measurement. The search for the hidden lines led the scholars to study the orientation of early pyramids. These structures represented the culmination of centuries of architectural development. They reflected the principles introduced by the visitors and preserved through myth and measurement. The builders used precise techniques to ensure that the sides of the pyramids aligned with specific celestial patterns. The scholars documented the alignment, believing that the structures preserved the hidden lines that defined the early dynasties. The pyramids represented a turning point in the civilization's understanding of the world. They reflected a level of precision difficult to achieve without careful measurement and observation. The scholars recognized that the pyramids required extensive knowledge of geometry. They believed that the visitors had introduced the principles that allowed early builders to develop these techniques. The people believed that the pyramids preserved the memory of the visitors. They saw the structures as connections between the earth and the sky. The hidden lines also influenced the design of the surrounding structures. Temples, causeways, and ceremonial spaces were arranged in ways that reflected the movement of the sun. The scholars recorded the orientation of these structures, noting how the light changed during different seasons. Their observations revealed patterns that supported the stories preserved in myth. The scholars believed that the structures represented a form of writing that preserved the visitors' teachings. The relationship between myth and measurement strengthened as the Old Kingdom matured. The people recognized that stories carried meaning beyond their literal interpretations. They understood that myth represented the memory of events that shaped their civilization. They believed that the visitors had introduced stories to help early humans understand the world. The scholars believed that measurement allowed individuals to verify and preserve these stories. They saw myth and measurement as two aspects of the same system. The scribes continued to record information with precision. They documented the scholars' findings, the builders' techniques, and the leaders' decisions. These records created a detailed account of the civilization's development. They preserved the integration of myth and measurement. They allowed future generations to study the relationship between the two. The scribes believed that their work helped maintain the connection between the past and the present. As the scholars continued their work, they identified new patterns within the structures. They recognized that certain measurements repeated across different buildings. These repeating patterns suggested a unified system of design. The scholars believed that the visitors had introduced this system. They sought to understand the principles behind it. Their studies led them to explore the relationships between different types of measurements. They compared lengths, angles, and proportions, discovering connections that supported the stories preserved in myth. The hidden lines became a symbol of the civilization's identity. They represented the integration of myth and measurement. They reminded the people that their world was shaped by principles introduced by the visitors. They guided the builders as they constructed new structures. They guided the scholars as they interpreted the teachings. They guided the leaders as they made decisions for the state. The hidden lines allowed the civilization to grow in ways that preserved its connection to the past. The Old Kingdom carried forward the legacy of the early dynasties. It expanded the structures, refined the techniques, and strengthened the system that connected myth and measurement. The civilization grew in complexity, but it remained anchored in the teachings introduced by the visitors. The hidden lines shaped the development of architecture, mathematics, astronomy, and governance. They influenced the design of temples, the orientation of monuments, and the layout of capitals. The scribes and scholars understood the importance of their work. They recognized that they were not only documenting the civilization's development, they were preserving the hidden lines that shaped their world. They believed that understanding these lines allowed them to maintain harmony between the physical and the unseen. They approached their work with a sense of responsibility, knowing that they were carrying forward a legacy older than their world. Through myth, measurement, and the hidden lines preserved in the structures of the Old Kingdom, the civilization maintained a connection to the moment when the visitors descended. It carried forward the teachings that shaped the foundations of early Egypt. It allowed the people to understand their world through stories and through numbers, through memory and through observation. It created a system that preserved balance, harmony, and continuity as the civilization moved toward its next horizon. The world shaped by the earliest dynasties continued to evolve long after the first kings stepped into the roles carved for them by memory, lineage, and the teachings that flowed from a night far older than any written scroll. As centuries layered themselves like sediment along the Nile's banks, stories of those early rulers settled into the collective understanding of the civilization. These stories carried traces of the moment when the visitors descended, forming a foundation that influenced kingship, ritual, architecture, and scholarship. Even as generations passed, and new rulers claimed the throne with their own accomplishments, the first kings retained a presence that seemed to glow across the long timeline of history. Their influence remained visible in symbols, structures, stories, and the rhythm of life that pulsed through the land. The early kings were remembered not because they sought recognition, but because they represented the beginning of something that endured. They were believed to be individuals who inherited a connection to a source of knowledge that came from beyond their world. This belief shaped how future generations interpreted their actions. The people saw the first kings as mediators between the physical world and the larger structure introduced by the visitors. The kings themselves lived in a world where this connection was not questioned. They accepted their roles as custodians of teachings that shaped every aspect of the civilization. The glow of these early kings persisted because their actions were woven into the origin of the structures that defined Egyptian identity. The earliest temples, aligned with celestial patterns, reflected their influence. The first tools, crafted with precision, reflected their guidance. The earliest laws, rituals, and symbols preserved the principles they carried. These contributions extended beyond the lifespan of any individual ruler. They became part of the civilization's foundation. The people believe that the first kings helped bridge the transition from a world shaped by the visitors to a world shaped by human understanding. The scholars who documented the civilization's growth recognized the importance of the first kings. They studied the early records carefully, noting how the decisions made during the earliest dynasties influenced the development of the Old Kingdom. They recognized that the foundations laid by the first kings continue to guide architectural design, agricultural planning, and ritual practices. The scholars believed that these foundations preserved the teachings introduced by the visitors. They saw the first kings as guardians who ensured that the teachings remained intact. The glow associated with the first kings did not come from the accomplishments typically recorded in chronicles of rulers. It came from the belief that they carried knowledge and responsibilities that connected them to a time when the world functioned differently. They represented the last link between humanity and the visitors. This belief gave their actions an enduring significance. The symbols associated with their reigns continued to appear in later structures, reminding the people of the origins of leadership. The first kings influenced the development of writing systems. The scribes who served during their reign recorded the earliest symbols that would evolve into hieroglyphs. These symbols reflected both practical information and aspects of the teachings introduced by the visitors. The scribes believed that writing preserved the continuity of knowledge. They viewed the first kings as individuals who facilitated the transition from oral memory to written record. Their contributions allowed future generations to study the origins of the civilization with clarity. The glow of the first kings also persisted through the layout of the land. The early capitals, arranged according to principles derived from the visitors' teachings, remained symbolic centers long after their original structures decayed. These locations continued to hold significance for later dynasties. The scholars recognized that the placement of these early capitals reflected a deeper understanding of the landscape. They believed the first kings understood how to align human settlements with the natural and celestial patterns that shaped the world. The influence of the first kings extended into the development of religious practices. Early rituals preserved in the temples reflected their understanding of the balance between the physical world and the unseen forces that governed it. These rituals emphasized harmony, gratitude, and continuity. The priests who inherited these rituals believed they preserved the teachings introduced by the visitors. They traced the origins of their practices to the actions of the first rulers. This belief strengthened the role of the first kings within the religious identity of the civilization. The glow of the first kings continued through the myths created to explain the origins of the world. These myths combined the memory of the visitors' descent with the actions of the earliest rulers. The people believed that the first kings understood the visitors' intentions and acted accordingly. This belief shaped the portrayal of the kings in the stories shared during festivals and ceremonies. The myths reflected a blend of memory, teaching, and interpretation. They preserved the belief that the actions of the first kings shaped the structure of the civilization. The markers of the first kings appeared in the art created generations later. Reliefs carved into temple walls included symbols that referenced the early dynasties. These symbols were used deliberately. They reminded the people of the origins of leadership. The artists believed that referencing the first kings preserved a connection to the visitors. They saw their work as a continuation of a legacy established long ago. These artistic representations added to the glow that surrounded the earliest rulers. The scholars who studied the alignment of early structures recognized that the first kings understood how to integrate myth and measurement. They examined the orientation of the earliest temples and noticed consistent patterns. These patterns reflected principles that guided the builders for centuries. The scholars believed that the first kings had learned these principles directly from the visitors. They recognized that the placement of structures influenced the rituals performed within them. This belief strengthened the scholars' respect for the early rulers. The glow of the first kings persisted through the development of early law. The legal codes introduced by the chosen individuals shaped the structure of the state. These codes emphasized fairness, responsibility, and the preservation of order. The leaders believed that maintaining stability required adherence to principles introduced by the visitors. The people accepted these laws because they believed the first kings acted with knowledge that extended beyond their own world. The laws continued to influence the development of governance throughout the Old Kingdom. The first kings also played a role in shaping attitudes toward the afterlife. The burial practices developed during their reign reflected the belief that leadership extended beyond physical existence. These practices emphasized the continuation of responsibility. The people believed that the first kings carried their connection to the visitors into the next cycle of existence. This belief shaped the development of early burial structures, which eventually evolved into the elaborate tombs built during later dynasties. The influence of the first kings persisted through the work of the scribes and scholars. Their records preserve details about the early rulers' actions, decisions, and teachings. The scribes believed that their work allowed future generations to understand the origins of the civilization. They documented the rituals, symbols, and myths associated with the first kings. These records allowed the scholars to study the civilization's early development. They helped preserve the glow associated with the first rulers. The scholars also uncovered artifacts that revealed details about the early dynasties. These artifacts included tools, pottery, and inscriptions that reflected the influence of the first kings. The scholars believed that these artifacts contained clues about the visitors' teachings. They examined each object carefully, searching for patterns that connected the past to the present. They recognized that the first kings used these objects to guide their people. This recognition strengthened the scholars' appreciation for the early rulers. The glow of the first kings continued to influence the design of later structures. The builders who constructed temples and monuments during the Old Kingdom referenced the principles used by the earliest rulers. They used similar units of measurement, similar alignment techniques, and similar symbolic arrangements. They believed that replicating these principles preserved the connection to the visitors. The builders saw themselves as part of a tradition initiated by the first kings. This belief shaped the identity of the civilization. The influence of the first kings extended into the development of early education. The scribes taught students about the origins of leadership. They explained the role of the first kings in preserving the visitors' teachings. The students learned how to interpret symbols, record measurements, and observe celestial patterns. They recognized that their work continued the legacy established long ago. This understanding gave their education purpose. They believed they were contributing to the civilization's continuity. The glow of the first kings persisted because their actions shaped the development of the civilization at every level. They guided the early builders, influenced the scribes, supported the scholars, and preserved the teachings introduced by the visitors. Their role extended beyond governance. It shaped the structure of the world the people inhabited. The memory of their actions persisted in every structure, symbol, and story that formed the cultural identity of Egypt. The scholars believed that understanding the first kings allowed them to understand the origins of the civilization. They studied the early records with care, noting how the leaders interpreted the visitors' teachings. They examined the alignment of structures, identifying the principles used by the early builders. They recognized that the civilization's strength came from the integration of myth and measurement. The first kings represented the beginning of this integration. Their actions laid the foundation for the achievements of the Old Kingdom. The glow of the first kings also persisted because the people believed they played a role in shaping the future. The stories shared during rituals emphasized that the first kings acted with awareness of their responsibilities. These stories described the kings as individuals who understood the connection between the world they inhabited and the larger structure introduced by the visitors. The people believed that remembering the first kings helped preserve the principles that guided the civilization. They viewed this memory as essential for maintaining harmony. As the civilization moved deeper into the Old Kingdom, the glow of the first kings remained embedded in the structures that defined daily life. The temples reflected their teachings. The symbols preserved their understanding. The laws maintained their emphasis on balance. The burial practices honored their belief in the continuation of responsibility. The people recognized that the first kings shaped the world they inherited. They believed that preserving the memory of these rulers preserved the stability of the civilization. The presence of the first kings remained visible in the orientation of the monumental structures that emerged during the Old Kingdom. The pyramids, built with precision, reflected principles introduced during the earliest dynasties. The scholars recognized that the orientation of the pyramids aligned with celestial patterns observed by the first kings. They believed that the builders who constructed the pyramids continued the work begun long ago. The people believed that the pyramids preserved the connection between the earth and the sky. The glow of the first kings lingered in the rituals performed within the temples. These rituals preserved the balance between the physical world and the unseen forces that shaped it. The priests traced the origins of these rituals to the early rulers. They believed that the first kings received guidance from the visitors. They preserved this guidance through rituals that emphasized harmony. These rituals helped maintain the order introduced by the visitors. The scholars continued to search for traces of the visitors' influence. They believed the world contained clues left behind by the beings who shaped the civilization. They studied the structures, symbols, and stories associated with the first kings. They recognized that the earliest rulers carried a responsibility that extended beyond their time. The scholars saw their own work as a continuation of that responsibility. They believed that understanding the origins of leadership would help preserve the civilization's stability. The glow of the first kings persisted because the civilization continued to interpret their actions through the lens of the teachings introduced by the visitors. The people believed that the first kings acted with clarity and purpose. They believed that the rulers understood the principles that governed the world. This belief shaped the identity of the civilization. It strengthened the connection between the past and the present. The first kings still glow in the dark of history because their influence shaped the earliest expressions of leadership. They guided the development of writing, architecture, agriculture, governance, and ritual. Their actions preserved the teachings introduced by the visitors. Their memory remained embedded in the structures that defined daily life. The glow persisted through the records preserved by the scribes, the studies conducted by the scholars, and the rituals performed by the priests. The civilization carried this glow forward, allowing it to illuminate the path laid by the earliest rulers. The presence of the first kings remained visible in every structure built to honor the past. It remained present in every symbol used to represent the principles introduced long ago. It remained alive in every story shared during rituals and gatherings. And through this persistent glow, the people preserved the connection between their world and the teachings that shaped the origins of the civilization, allowing the earliest rulers to remain visible across the long timeline of history.